The most important weapon in Nordic history was buried in pieces. No single companion carried all of it. No single tomb held all of it. It was broken apart on purpose, and every fragment was given to a different warrior to keep. Think about what that means. The most sacred blade of an entire civilization was deliberately shattered and spread across the continent, not to destroy it, not to hide it from enemies, but because that was the only way the companions knew to protect it. They trusted people over stone. They trusted warriors over vaults. That is where tonight begins. Welcome, and thank you for being here. Pull whatever you have close and get comfortable. Tonight, we are moving through the oldest part of Skyrim's weapon history blades that came before the kingdoms, before the jarls, before the roads and the holds and the carved stone walls. These are the weapons that existed when Skyrim was still being decided, when it was not yet a country. Just a cold, open question. Wuthrad, the great axe of Isgramor, spent most of its history in pieces. After the original blade was shattered, its fragments were not stored in any single location. Each piece was given to a different member of the companions to carry. This was a deliberate choice. The companions believed the axe held too much weight, too much history, too much meaning to rest in any one place. By distributing its fragments, they distributed the responsibility of protecting it. Every warrior who carried a piece carried a share of something much larger than a weapon. When the axe was finally reassembled, those within the companions treated the moment carefully. It was not simply a repair, it was the completion of something that had been held in trust across generations. The blade had waited, the people had held their part, and when the pieces came back together, everything that had been kept in them came back together too. Before iron was worked in Skyrim, the Nords shaped their weapons from what the land gave them: antler, bone, heavy wood from the coldest trees. The people who first crossed from Atmora did not arrive with the knowledge of smelting. They arrived with the need to survive, and they worked with what was in front of them. The ironworking techniques came later, carried over through continued contact with their homeland across the Northern Sea. But those early weapons were not weak things. They were made with care. They were designed with purpose. They were used in real battles by real warriors who had no other option. There is something grounding about that. The most basic materials, shaped carefully enough, still cut, still held, still carried someone through the dark and the cold to the other side of a fight. There is a belief inside ancient Nordic burial custom that does not always make it into the written histories. When certain warriors were laid to rest, the weapons placed beside them were broken before they went into the ground. Not broken by age, not worn down, broken on purpose by the hands of the people who loved them. The reasoning was specific and old. A blade that had seen real battles had accumulated something. Not a spirit in the way a person has a spirit, but a quality, a weight built from everything the weapon had passed through. Breaking the blade before burial was believed to release that quality, to free it. The sword went into the earth, but what the sword had carried went ahead, following the warrior into whatever came next. It is a careful idea, gentle even. The Nords of that era thought about weapons the way they thought about people, as things that could be more than their material. The katanas carried by the blades did not come from any Nordic tradition. They were not designed in Skyrim. They were not shaped by Nordic hands. They came from the Akaviri, the invaders who crossed the sea in the early First Era and pushed deep into Tamriel before being turned back. The war was over, but the weapons stayed. Some were taken as trophies, some were studied. Over time, those who would become the blades recognized something in the Akaviri: design, a balance, a sharpness, a quality of construction that differed from what they were already using. They adopted it, refined it, carried it across generations until the katana became the signature of an organization that had no Akaviri blood at all. A weapon born in one culture, taken in war, and slowly claimed by another until the origin was almost forgotten. That is a long and quiet journey for a piece of steel. Beneath the stone streets of Markarth, In the ruins that sit under the city itself, there are weapon fragments that do not belong to the Nords. The Reach has been occupied by many peoples across many eras, and its deepest ruins hold evidence of all of them. Some of the blade remnants found there predate the period when Nordic settlers moved into the region. They are older than the occupation, older than the conflict. They were made by people who had no reason to think any of that was coming. The metal is worn past the point where style or technique can be fully read, but the shape of certain pieces and the materials they were made from suggest a level of craft that had been developing for a long time before the Nords arrived. Someone was living there. Someone was building things. Someone was armed and prepared and going about their days. The ruins hold that fact quietly, even when the official histories move past it. The first enchanted blade in confirmed Nordic record was not carried by a fighter. It was carried by a priest of Kine. That distinction meant something in early Nordic culture more than it might seem today. Warriors and priests occupied entirely separate relationships to power. A warrior's strength came from within, from their arm, their training, their steel, their will. Enchantment, in the eyes of many early Nordic fighters, introduced something outside that relationship. It suggested a reliance on forces beyond the person carrying the blade. A warrior who needed a spell woven into their weapon was, to some, a warrior who did not fully trust their own capability. Priests operated differently. Their connection to power ran through devotion and service, not physical mastery. A blade given to a priest of Kine was never just a weapon. It was an extension of her will, a way of carrying something sacred into a moment that required it. The fact that this is the first enchanted blade in Nordic written record tells us where the culture's deepest trust was placed. Some ancient Nordic greatswords were not balanced the way later swords were. They carried their weight lower near the grip and base of the blade, rather than toward the tip. This seems counterintuitive until you consider where these weapons were used. Fighting in deep snow is not like fighting on open ground. A front-weighted blade can catch in a drift at exactly the wrong moment. It can drag the arm forward and leave a fighter exposed. A base-weighted blade stays responsive even when the ground beneath the fighter shifts. The warriors who designed these weapons were not guessing. They were making something for a specific environment: cold ground, unstable footing, thick layered clothing that reduced the range of movement. The weight distribution was a solution to a real problem. Someone had thought it through carefully before the first swing was ever taken. When the 500 sailed from Atmora to take back Skyrim, the weapons they carried were not enchanted, not one of them. This was not poverty or lack of access. It was a choice built on a specific belief about what enchantment cost a warrior. To weave a spell into a blade, in the view of the original companions, was to introduce distance. The weapon became something other than a pure extension of the person holding it. It became a tool, something with a separate function, something that could, in theory, be set aside or replaced. The companions wanted the opposite of that. They wanted weapons that could not be separated from the people carrying them, a bond that was personal and continuous. Enchantment, they felt, interrupted that bond before it could fully form. So they went into the field with clean steel and their own skill, and nothing added that did not belong to them already. There is one detail about Wuthrad that survived outside the formal histories, passed down in older accounts, spoken more than written. The axe head, when the wind moved across it in a certain way, produced a sound, not the sound of air passing over a hard surface, something lower and more even than that. Veterans who had carried individual pieces of the shattered weapon used the same word for it across separate accounts. They called it a hum. Some of them called it breathing. That specific word appears more than once, written by different people who had no connection to each other. Whether they meant it as description or as something closer to belief is not clear from the texts. But when multiple people, separately, reach for the same word to describe the same thing, that tends to mean the experience was real to them. And real experiences, even the ones we cannot fully explain, leave marks. These were the weapons that came before everything else, before the kingdoms, before the wars, before the names that history remembered. The hands that made them are long gone, but somewhere beneath the stone and the snow, the metal still holds its shape, still waiting, still keeping whatever it was given to keep. Deep underground, in corridors that have not seen light in thousands of years, the weapons are still there. Not rusted, not crumbling, not lost to time the way everything else eventually is. The Dwemer built things differently than any other civilization in Tamriel's history. Their weapons were not made to be held by a person who had a name and a home and a reason to fight. They were made to last, and they have. Dwemer metal does not rust. That is not a small thing. Every other material that has ever been buried underground for 1,000 years comes back damaged, corroded, brittle, worn, past usefulness. Dwemer blades come back whole. The surface is unchanged. The edge holds. Researchers who have recovered weapons from ruins that have been sealed since the late First Era report finding them in the same condition as the day they were set down. No one has fully explained why. The metal itself resists the process that breaks down everything else. It does not react to moisture or air the way iron or steel does. Whatever the Dwemer added to the composition, whatever process they used, they built something that time has not been able to touch. That fact alone separates them from every other metalworking tradition in recorded history. All other races in Tamriel used bows. Simple, clean, effective, a bent piece of wood and a pulled string. The Dwemer looked at that design and built something else entirely. Their crossbow was the first mechanical ranged weapon on the continent. It used tension stored in a drawn mechanism rather than the strength of the person holding it. That distinction mattered. A crossbow does not require the same physical training as a traditional bow. It can be loaded, held, and released by someone with far less upper body strength. The Dwemer understood this. They were not building weapons for warriors who trained their whole lives. They were building weapons for a civilization that valued efficiency and repeatability over individual skill. The crossbow was a natural result of how they thought about everything. There are no Dwemer weapons made for a specific person, not one. In every other culture across Tamriel, weapons were personal objects. They were commissioned by a specific warrior, shaped to their grip, sometimes named. The Dwemer produced their weapons differently. The blades, the axes, the crossbows, all of them were standardized, made to the same dimensions, the same weight, the same specifications. Over and over again, they were not gifts or symbols. They were components. The animunculi, the mechanical constructs that still move through Dwemer ruins today, were armed with these weapons the same way a machine is fitted with a part. The weapon existed to serve a function. The function did not require the weapon to be personal. That philosophy separates Dwemer weapon culture from every other tradition in a way that is quiet, but very deep. Certain Dwemer blades were found with hollow spaces built into the handle, not accidental gaps, deliberate chambers, precisely shaped, running along the interior of the grip. Researchers studying these handles believe the chambers were designed to produce vibration when the blade was in motion. The resonance created by that vibration was thought to interfere with magical effects in the immediate area. A fighter carrying one of these blades would not cast spells more easily, but spells cast against them might land less cleanly. The Dwemer had a complicated relationship with magic. They studied it, used it, and also distrusted it deeply. Building a weapon that could quietly resist magical interference fits exactly with how they approached most problems. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just with a small, careful design choice buried inside the handle where no one would see it. No one has ever successfully melted a Dwemer weapon down and reshaped it. Many have tried. Blacksmiths across Tamriel, across multiple eras, have taken Dwemer metal to the hottest forges they could build and found that the material simply does not respond. It warms, it conducts heat, but it does not reach a state where it can be worked. The melting point, if there is one, sits beyond what any known forge can produce. What this means practically is that every Dwemer weapon in existence is irreplaceable. If it breaks, it cannot be reforged. If it is lost, nothing like it can be made again. The Dwemer are gone, and the knowledge of how they worked their metal went with them. What remains is a fixed quantity, a closed set of objects that will never be added to, only slowly reduced as time takes what it can. Among the bolt designs recovered from Dwemer ruins, several stand out. Most bolts are solid, a simple, pointed shaft designed to penetrate. But a number of recovered examples are hollow at the tip. The cavity is too deliberate and too consistent to be a flaw in the manufacturing process. The most straightforward explanation is that these bolts were designed to carry something, a liquid payload, sealed inside the tip that would release on impact. What liquid was used is not recorded anywhere in recovered Dwemer texts. The hollow bolts were found in storage near what appear to be crossbow stations, positions built into the walls of certain corridors that suggest permanent defensive placements. Whatever those bolts were loaded with, the Dwemer considered it important enough to build an entire separate bolt design around it. The Dwarven Centurion is not typically described as a weapon. It is a construct, a massive mechanical figure built from Dwemer metal and powered by steam. But the arm it uses in combat was formally classified as a weapon in early Imperial research on Dwemer technology. The steam arm has internal pressure valves. Those valves can be adjusted, or rather, they were designed to be adjustable, meaning the force of the strike could be modulated depending on the situation. A lower pressure setting produces a controlled impact. A higher setting produces something much harder to survive. The Dwemer built flexibility into a system that most people encounter only at its maximum setting. That detail suggests the Centurion was not designed purely for destruction. It was designed to be controlled. The range of force available to it implies a range of intended uses. Dwemer war axes were built shorter than the axes used by Nordic warriors. The difference is not subtle, it is significant enough to suggest a completely different combat environment. Nordic axes were designed for open ground, where reach matters and wide swings are possible. Dwemer axes were designed for tunnels, underground corridors where the ceiling is low and the walls are close, and a full swing is not an option. The shorter blade stays usable in confined spaces. It does not catch on stone. It does not require the fighter to step back before swinging. Every dimension of the Dwemer axe reflects the environment it was made for, a world of narrow passages and low ceilings and permanent artificial light. A world that existed entirely below the surface of Tamriel, and that shaped every tool made within it. Not one surviving Dwemer record contains the name of a weapon. No blade is called anything. No axe has a history attached to it. No crossbow was passed down with a story. In every other culture with a weapon tradition, Nordic, Orcish, Imperial, Elven, named weapons appear constantly. A blade earns a name through a battle, or an owner, or a moment that made it worth remembering. The Dwemer never did this. Their weapons were catalogued by type and specification, not by identity. Whether this was a cultural choice or simply a reflection of how they saw the relationship between a person and a tool is not clear from what survives. But the absence is complete. In thousands of years of Dwemer record-keeping, not one weapon was ever given a name. They built things to last forever. They just never saw a reason to remember them. The Dwemer are gone. Their cities are sealed. Their constructs still move through the dark, armed with weapons that will outlast everything built after them. Whatever the Dwemer understood about metal, they kept it entirely to themselves, and the silence they left behind is as permanent as the blades. Not all weapons were made by hands. Some were made by will, by intent, by something much older and much less predictable than any smith who ever stood at a forge. The Daedric princes do not create the way mortals create. They do not measure and plan and test. They reach into the world and leave something behind, and what they leave behind tends to carry a piece of whatever they are. These weapons are not tools. They are expressions, and expressions of that kind do not always behave the way their owners expect. Mehrunes' razor does not work the way most weapons work. A blade cuts, it damages the body, it ends a life through physical harm. The razor does something different. What it targets is not the flesh. It reaches past the body entirely and strikes at something underneath the soul itself. The physical wound may be small. The deeper damage is not. This is why the razor has been treated differently than ordinary weapons across every era it has appeared in. It is not simply dangerous. It is dangerous in a way that armor cannot address and healing magic cannot fully reverse. The body can be mended. What the razor touches cannot always be put back the way it was. Mehrunes Dagon built violation into the blade at the most fundamental level. That has never changed, regardless of whose hands have carried it. Dawnbreaker is carried as a weapon against the undead. That is the version of its purpose most people know. Meridia gifted it to mortals as a tool for fighting the darkness that corruption leaves behind. But older lore suggests the blade was not originally made for mortals at all. The earliest accounts describe Dawnbreaker as something Meridia created for her own servants, a punishment weapon, a blade designed to be used against those who had served her and then fallen away from her light. The undead that Dawnbreaker destroys so cleanly are, in a sense, the same category of being things that were meant to move on and did not. The weapon's original purpose and its current one are not as different as they might seem. Meridia did not change what the blade was built for. She simply found a wider use for it. The mace of Molag Bal was not designed to kill quickly. It was designed to take something. When the mace connects, it pulls magicka from the person it strikes and transfers it to the wielder. That transaction is not incidental. It was built into the weapon deliberately. Molag Bal is the Daedric prince of domination, of subjugation, of the erasure of a person's independence. A weapon that reaches into someone and takes what belongs to them fits his nature exactly. The mace does not just harm its target. It makes the target smaller while making the person holding it larger. That exchange, repeated, is a kind of message. Every time the weapon is used, it demonstrates something about the relationship between power and those who do not have it. Molag Bal designed that message into the metal. The ebony blade grows stronger through betrayal. That is its defining property, the thing that separates it from every other Daedric weapon in existence. Most weapons are charged through combat or through soul gems. The ebony blade is charged through acts of treachery against people who trusted the wielder. Every time that trust is broken, every time the blade is used against someone who believed themselves safe, something is absorbed into the steel. The blade becomes heavier with it, more powerful, more present. Mephala, the prince who governs it, is the Daedra of secrets and manipulation. A weapon that feeds on betrayal is not a random design choice. It is a reflection of everything Mephala values. The blade does not just reward deception, it requires it. Carrying it long enough changes what a person is willing to do. That may be the point. Volendrung did not begin as a Daedric weapon. Before Malakath claimed it, the hammer existed under a different name, Volendung, and it was Dwemer in origin. The Dwemer built it, they used it, and then they disappeared, as they always do in these stories, and the hammer was left behind without an owner. Malakath found it, or claimed it, or simply decided it belonged to him. The details of the transfer are not recorded. What is recorded is that the weapon changed after that. The Dwemer hammer became something with a different weight to it, a Daedric artifact carrying all the associations that come with Malakath's domain. Outcasts, strength earned through suffering, the refusal to be discarded. A Dwemer weapon adopted by the Daedric prince of the abandoned is either a coincidence or something much more deliberate. Given who Malakath is, deliberate seems more likely. Azura has never given a weapon to any mortal, Not one. Every other Daedric prince with a significant presence in Tamriel's history has produced at least one physical artifact, a blade, a hammer, a staff, something that can be held and carried and used. Azura operates differently. Her gifts come through vision, through prophecy, through knowledge of what is coming, and the quiet advantage that knowledge provides. She does not hand a person a blade and send them into a fight. She tells them what the fight will look like before it begins. Whether that is more or less powerful than a physical weapon depends on the situation. But the pattern is consistent across every era she has appeared in. Azura shapes outcomes through information, not armaments. She has apparently never felt the need to change that approach. The sanguine rose does not look like a weapon. It is shaped like a flower, decorative, soft in appearance, the kind of object that belongs in a display case rather than a battlefield. The Mages Guild classified it as a weapon anyway. Technically, what the rose does is summon a Daedra. The summoned creature fights. The rose itself never strikes anything. But the Guild's classification holds because the intent of the object is combat. The rose is used to introduce a hostile entity into a situation, and that makes it a weapon, regardless of its appearance. Sanguine, the prince it belongs to, finds this classification entertaining. He finds most things entertaining. The rose was never meant to be taken seriously as an instrument of war. The fact that it technically qualifies as one is exactly the kind of detail Sanguine would enjoy. Clavicus Vile does not give gifts without conditions. That is not a theory. It is a pattern that runs through every interaction he has with mortals across recorded history. The rueful axe fits the pattern exactly. It was offered as a gift. It was presented as something the recipient wanted or needed. The cost attached to it was not explained up front. That is how Vile works. The weapon itself is real, it functions, it has power, it can be used. But the terms surrounding it are never what they appear to be at first. Vile is not interested in giving mortals things that simply help them. He is interested in the moment when a mortal realizes the full shape of what they agreed to. The rueful axe is one example of that interest. It is not the only one. Several weapons across Tamriel carry Sheogorath's influence. They do not all look the same or work the same way. What they share is a single consistent quality. They do not behave predictably. In the hands of a novice, that unpredictability might seem like chaos. In the hands of a master, it behaves exactly the same way. Skill does not stabilize a weapon touched by the Mad Prince. Experience does not make it more reliable. Every time such a weapon is used, the outcome sits slightly outside what the wielder planned for. Sheogorath does not seem to consider this a flaw. From his perspective, a weapon that always does exactly what it is supposed to do is a weapon that has stopped being interesting. His influence in these objects is not accidental contamination. It is a design preference. Daedric weapons are not simply powerful. They are statements. Each one reflects something essential about the prince. It came from their values, their obsessions, the particular way they see mortals, and the world mortals live in. Picking one up is never just picking up a weapon. It is stepping into a relationship with something that was never fully yours to begin with. A blade is steel. A spell is intention. Binding one to the other is not a simple act. Most people who carry enchanted weapons do not think much about what is happening inside the metal when they swing it. They feel the frost or the fire, and they move on. But enchanters, who have spent their lives studying this process, describe something more complicated. A relationship between the weapon, the soul that powers it, and the person holding it that does not always stay neat and contained. Tonight we move into that space, quietly, carefully, the way the subject deserves. Soul gems are not simply storage containers. That is the most common misunderstanding about how weapon enchanting works. A soul gem does not hold power the way a flask holds water, something passive and still, waiting to be poured out. The soul inside the gem is active. Every time an enchanted weapon strikes, the soul responds. It reaches through the enchantment and powers the effect in real time. What this means is that the weapon is not drawing on stored energy. It is drawing on something that is still, in some sense, present, still there, still doing something. Enchanters who work at the highest levels of the craft describe the relationship between soul and enchantment as closer to a contract than a mechanism. The soul provides. The enchantment delivers. The weapon is the space between them where that exchange happens. When the gem empties, it is not because the energy ran out. It is because the soul has given everything it had to give. Not every enchanted blade was made in a laboratory. Some of the oldest enchanted weapons in Skyrim's history were produced in temples by priests who understood power through devotion rather than academic study. The distinction matters more than it might seem. A mage binds an enchantment by understanding the mechanics of it, by knowing precisely what the spell does and how to anchor it to a physical object. A priest works differently. The blessing they place in a blade comes from a relationship with something larger than technique. It flows through faith, through years of service, through a connection to a divine or a force that the priest has spent their life cultivating. Blades enchanted this way do not always follow the same rules as academically produced enchantments. They tend to be harder to study, harder to replicate, and in several documented cases, harder to remove. There is a recorded phenomenon among long-term users of heavily enchanted weapons. Enchanters call it bleed. Over time, a weapon that carries a powerful or complex enchantment begins to exert a subtle influence on the person carrying it. Not dramatically, not suddenly, gradually. The wielder's decisions start to reflect the nature of the enchantment in small ways. Someone carrying a blade with a domination enchantment becomes slightly more controlling in ordinary interactions. Someone carrying a weapon tied to deception becomes more comfortable with small evasions. The change is slow enough that the person rarely notices it happening to them. Others around them do. This is one reason experienced enchanters advise against carrying the same heavily enchanted weapon for too many years without rotation. The blade begins to have opinions, and eventually, without meaning to, the person carrying it starts sharing them. Azura's star looks like a soul gem. It functions like a soul gem, but it is not a soul gem in the ordinary sense, and the difference is significant. A standard soul gem is used once the soul inside powers an enchantment, and the gem is spent. Azura's star does not empty. The soul can be released, and the gem can be used again. Azura created it with a specific purpose in mind. At the time, mages who needed to recharge enchanted weapons had limited options. Lesser souls, animals, small creatures were the most accessible. Trapping them was accepted practice, but not considered entirely comfortable even then. Azura's star was intended to offer an alternative, a gem that could hold a soul temporarily, use it, and allow it to move on rather than consuming it permanently. Whether that purpose has always been honored by everyone who has carried the star is a different question, but that was what it was made for. Shock enchantments do not work the same way fire or frost does. Fire burns tissue. Frost slows blood and stiffens muscle. Shock does something different. It interrupts the body's internal signals. The nervous system runs on electrical impulses. A shock enchantment does not need to cause a visible wound to be effective. It introduces interference into a system that requires precise, uninterrupted communication to function. A target hit with a shock enchantment may find that their arm does not respond to what their mind tells it to do. Their grip fails. Their footing shifts. Their reaction time drops in ways they cannot compensate for, because the delay is happening between the thought and the body, not in either one separately. Enchanters who have studied this effect note that shock is the most neurologically invasive of the three elemental enchantment types. The body can recover from cold and heat. Interrupting the nervous system is a more complicated kind of damage to undo. The fiery soul trap enchantment attempts two things at the same time. It applies fire damage, and it traps the soul of whatever it kills. In theory, these two effects complement each other. In practice, enchanters who work with this combination regularly describe it as unstable. The fire component and the soul trap component occasionally work against each other. The fire damages the soul before it can be cleanly captured. The soul trap delays the fire effect while it attempts to secure its target. In a small number of documented cases, the conflict between the two effects caused the enchantment to misfire, entirely producing neither outcome cleanly. Most enchanters who discuss this acknowledge that the combination works often enough to remain popular, but it works at a lower rate of reliability than either effect would achieve alone. Someone, at some point, decided the combination was worth the instability. That decision has been revisited many times since. The enchantment known as Turn Undead was not developed for battle. The original application was maintenance. Tombs across Skyrim required keepers, people whose job was to move through burial sites, ensure the wards remained intact, and address any disturbances without causing additional ones. A keeper who encountered a risen Droger in a sealed tomb did not want to fight. A fight risked damaging the burial site, disturbing other interred dead, and drawing attention to a location that was supposed to remain quiet. Turn Undead gave keepers a way to move through those encounters without direct confrontation. The risen dead were redirected. The keeper continued their work. The tomb stayed intact. Combat versions of the enchantment came later, developed by people who recognized that the same effect that redirected a Draugr in a corridor would work just as well on a battlefield. But the original purpose was far quieter than its current reputation suggests. The oldest enchanted blade in the College of Winterhold archives has been recharged more times than anyone has counted. It is old enough that the name of its creator does not appear in any surviving record. What has been documented is what has happened to it over the centuries of continuous use. Enchantments, under normal circumstances, remain stable between charges. They do not drift. They do not change. But this blade has been recharged so many times, by so many different hands, with so many different soul gems, that something in the original binding has shifted. The enchantment it produces today is not identical to what it produced when it was first made. The difference is subtle, a slight variation in the quality of the effect, a small change in how it interacts with certain targets. No one knows exactly when the drift began. No one can say what the original enchantment was, precisely, because no record survives that describes it in enough detail to compare. The blade works. It has always worked. It just no longer works exactly the way its maker intended. Time and repeated use changed it into something slightly new. That may say something about enchantments. It may say something about time. Possibly both. Binding magic to steel is never a neutral act. Something is always exchanged between the soul that powers it, the weapon that carries it, and the person who wields it over years and years of use. The blade changes, and quietly, without always meaning to, so does the person holding it. The weapons of the Forsworn do not come from a forge. They come from something older than forges, from the bones of animals and the blood of rituals and the voice of a Hagraven speaking in the dark. The Reach has its own relationship with weapons, one that has nothing to do with fire and anvil and the clean, predictable logic of metalwork. What the Forsworn make is stranger than that, more personal, more alive, in a way that proper smithed steel never quite manages to be. Every component of a Forsworn weapon is chosen deliberately. The bone comes from specific animals, not whatever is available, but whatever is appropriate to the weapon's intended purpose. The antler is selected for density and curve. The hay-graven feathers woven into the binding are not decorative. Each material connects the finished weapon to something in the old Reach tradition, a spirit, a force, a relationship between the maker and the land that predates the Nordic occupation by a very long time. When a Forsworn weapon is complete, it is not simply a tool, it is an argument, a statement about where the Reach came from and who it still belongs to. The Forsworn do not separate their weapons from their beliefs. The two are the same thing, expressed in different forms. The blood coating found on many Forsworn blades is not poison in the way most people understand poison. It does not damage the body directly. It does not cause illness or accelerate physical harm. What it does is interfere with restorative magic. A person wounded by a treated Forsworn blade will find that healing spells work less cleanly than they should. The connection between the wound and the restoration is disrupted. The magic lands but does not take hold the way it normally would. This effect comes from Haygraven blood, which carries properties that resist the kind of structured, orderly magic that healing requires. Haygravens exist in a state that is deliberately contrary to natural order. Their blood carries that quality. When it is applied to a blade, the blade shares it, passing that resistance into every wound it opens. Briarheart warriors are not entirely alive in the usual sense. The ritual that creates them involves removing the physical heart from the chest and replacing it with a briar heart, a dense, stone-like growth produced by Hagraven magic. The warrior survives this. They continue to fight. They are stronger after it than before. What is less commonly known is that the removed heart does not always go to waste. In certain Forsworn traditions, the original heart, still carrying the warrior's essence, is incorporated into a weapon, not as a decoration, as a component. The belief is that the heart, separated from the body but not from the person, becomes a source of power that can be bound into a blade. The warrior fights with a weapon that carries something of themselves inside it. The connection between them is literal, more literal than most weapon traditions would ever attempt. Forsworn smiths do not use conventional forges. The Reach sits on a network of natural geothermal activity, hot springs, steam vents, mineral-rich water that runs hotter than anything on the surface should. Reach smiths learned to use this. Bone and treated materials were submerged in specific hot spring locations for extended periods. The minerals in the water, combined with the heat and the duration of exposure, produced a hardening effect that conventional fire could not replicate on these materials. The process is slow. It requires knowledge of which springs produce which mineral concentrations and how long different materials need to be treated. That knowledge was developed over generations. It did not come from anywhere outside the Reach. It came from the Reach itself, from paying close attention to what the land offered and learning to use it precisely. Forsworn arrows are not straight. Most arrows are engineered for straight flight. The shaft is as true as the maker can produce. The fletching balanced to keep it on course. Forsworn arrows curve, slightly, deliberately, in a specific direction that accounts for the wind patterns that move through the mountain passes of the Reach at different times of day. An archer who knows those patterns can use a curved arrow to hit a target that a straight arrow would miss. The wind carries the curve where it needs to go. To anyone outside the Reach, the arrow looks wrong. To a forsworn archer who has spent their life in those passes, it is the straight arrow that seems naive, built for flat ground and open air, useless against the particular behavior of mountain wind. A forsworn weapon is not considered complete until its intended warrior has bled on it. This is not a symbolic gesture, it is a functional step in the weapon's creation. The blood of the warrior is the weapon's first contact with what it is being made for. The makers of the weapon consider this the first test, not of the weapon's edge, but of the relationship between the weapon and the person who will carry it. The blood binds them. It introduces the warrior's presence into the object before any battle has been fought. After that first contact, the weapon is considered oriented, pointed, in some sense, toward the person it belongs to. A forsworn warrior who picks up someone else's weapon without this bond is considered to be carrying something that does not know them. And something that does not know you, the tradition holds, cannot fully protect you. Hagravens speak to forsworn weapons. That is the belief held by Reach shamans across generations of oral tradition. Before a weapon is carried into use, a hagraven must speak over it. Not a formal incantation, not a structured spell with fixed words, just the witch's voice, moving across the surface of the blade or the bone, in whatever language the hagraven chooses. The shamans describe this as the moment the weapon becomes alive. Before the voice, it is shaped material. After the voice, it is something that can act in the world with intention. Whether this belief reflects something literally true about the weapons is not something outside researchers have been able to confirm. What is documented is that Forsworn, who carry weapons that have not received this treatment report, feeling a difference. The weapon works. It just does not feel the same. That distinction, to the Forsworn, is everything. The weapons found in pre-Nord ruins across the Reach look nothing like modern Forsworn arms. The old Reach, the civilization that existed before the Nordic occupation, changed everything, worked primarily in copper. Their blades were copper-edged, sometimes stone-reinforced, shaped with tools and techniques that bore no relationship to the bone and blood craft the Forsworn use today. The shift happened gradually, across the long period of occupation and resistance. As access to copper deposits was lost or blocked, the Reachmen adapted. They moved to materials the land still offered freely: bone, antler, hagraven-treated components. The modern Forsworn arsenal is not an ancient tradition. It is a survival tradition. It is what the old Reach became when the old Reach lost access to what it used to build with. There is a particular kind of resilience in that. The weapons changed completely. The intention behind them never did. The Forsworn did not choose to build weapons this way. They built weapons this way because it was what remained to them. And what remained to them, they made into something that has outlasted every attempt to erase it. Before there were armies, there were hunters. Before tactics and formations and the organized violence of war, there was a person standing still in cold air, watching something move through trees, deciding when to release. The bow is older than most weapons in Skyrim's history, older than the kingdoms that eventually claimed it. Tonight we move through the lore of archery, the traditions, the unusual cases, and the weapons that carried hunters from the earliest days of the continent all the way through to the present. Bosmer bows are not made from wood. The Green Pact forbids it. The Bosmer of Valenwood made a covenant with the forest itself. They do not cut, consume, or use any plant matter for any purpose. Everything they build must come from animals. Their bows are made from the bones of creatures the archer has personally hunted and killed. Not purchased, not traded for, personally taken. The bow a Bosmer archer carries is a direct record of their hunting history, built from animals they tracked and faced themselves. The grip, the limbs, the reinforcing material along the back of the bow, all of it came from something the archer once stood across from in the wild. That relationship between the hunter and their weapon is not incidental to Bosmer culture. It is the foundation of it. Nordic hunters had a specific belief about naming bows. A bow did not earn a name until it had made its first successful kill. Until that moment, the bow was considered unfinished, functional, but incomplete. An unnamed bow was also considered unlucky in a practical sense. Hunters who carried unnamed bows were thought to be pressing their fortune in a direction it did not want to go. The name was not chosen by the hunter alone. It came from the first kill, from whatever that moment produced in terms of a memory or an image or a quality worth remembering. A hunter who killed a white deer at dawn might name the bow for that light. A hunter whose first kill came in a snowstorm might name it for the sound the wind made. The bow and the name came together in the same moment, and after that they were inseparable. Auriel's bow is the oldest ranged weapon in any surviving account of Tamriel's history. It appears before kingdoms, before wars, before most of the events that shaped the continent into what it became. Its earliest recorded use is from a time before recorded time, the moment when the heart of Lorcan was struck from the sky. The exact nature of that event is told differently across different traditions, but the presence of the bow in that moment places it at the very beginning of the world as Tamriel's history understands it. Everything that followed, every war, every king, every civilization, came after the bow had already done the most significant thing it would ever do. It has been used many times since. None of those uses changed what it was. It came into the world doing something unrepeatable, and it has carried that weight ever since. Blood-cursed arrows are made with Serana's blood. That process alone sets them apart from every other arrow type in Skyrim's history. But what they do when fired from Auriel's bow is the detail that makes them worth noting carefully. A blood-cursed arrow fired from the bow does not simply fly and strike. It reaches the sky. The sun dims. Not permanently, not a lasting change to the world, but for a period. The light that crosses Tamriel is interrupted. There is no other weapon in recorded history that has affected the sky. Not Daedric artifacts, not enchanted blades, not the Thuum itself. Only this specific combination, these specific arrows, this specific bow produces that effect. The scale of it is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. A weapon, an arrow, the sun, briefly, going dark. Falmer bows are built entirely from underground materials. No part of them has ever seen sunlight. The wood, if it can be called wood, is a pale fungal growth cultivated in the deep places where the Falmer live. It does not behave exactly like surface wood. It is more brittle in dry conditions but holds tension better in the damp underground air it was grown in. The arrows fired from these bows are made from the same material. Everything about Falmer archery is adapted to an environment that exists completely below the surface of the world. The weapons work in that environment with the same logic that Forsworn weapons work in the Reach designed for a specific place by people who never expected to fight anywhere else. Take them out of their environment and they perform differently. In it, they are exactly what they need to be. The Thieves' Guild did not favor blades for fieldwork. They favored crossbows, not for killing, for disabling. A crossbow bolt placed carefully does not need to be lethal. It can stop a target cleanly, create enough time for an extraction to complete, and leave the situation manageable in a way that a blade rarely does. The guild's preference for the crossbow was also practical in terms of concealment. A crossbow can be prepared in advance and held ready without the visible draw of a traditional bow. In an urban environment, in tight corridors, in situations where the difference between success and exposure is a few seconds of preparation time, that advantage matters. The Thieves' Guild was not an organization that fought when it could avoid fighting. The crossbow suited that philosophy exactly. Silver arrows appeared in Nordic burial rites. One was placed in the quiver of a warrior, being interred not as a symbol, but as a practical provision. The Nords who practiced this believed that the hunt continued after death. Sovngarde was not only a place of rest and feasting, it was also a place where the skills a warrior had built in life remained meaningful. A hunter who arrived without arrows would find themselves poorly equipped for what waited on the other side. The silver was chosen specifically because it held significance in transition in the movement between states, between living and what came after. One arrow, one hunt. The burial party made sure their warrior had at least that much waiting for them when they arrived. The bow style used in Halfingar and the style used in the Rift are different enough to identify by sight. Halfingar favors a longer bow taller, with more limb length, suited to the open coastal approaches and longer sight lines around solitude. The Rift favors a shorter recurve design compact, faster to draw, built for the dense forest and closer range hunting that the terrain around Riften demands. The difference developed over centuries, without any central decision being made. Regional hunters responded to regional conditions. The wood available in each area influenced what could be built. The game they hunted shaped what kind of shot was typically needed. Two bows in the same province, telling two completely different stories about the land they came from. Auriel's bow was not made for war. Its original purpose was ceremonial. The Aldmer, the ancient elves from whom the modern elven races descended, used it in religious rituals long before the wars that made it famous. The precise nature of those rituals is not fully recorded, but the accounts that survive describe the bow as a sacred object that marked specific moments in the calendar, a weapon used to punctuate time rather than end lives. The transition from ceremonial object to instrument of war happened the way those transitions usually happen, gradually, through circumstances that left no better option. By the time the bow appeared in the conflicts that carried it through history, its original purpose was already a distant memory. What it had been made for, and what it was used for, had separated so completely that most people who have carried it since have never known there was a difference. A bow remembers every hand that has drawn it, every arrow it has sent into the world. The hunters who named their bows understood something true about that a weapon used long enough stops being just an object and starts being a record. Tonight, those records rest quietly in the dark, patient, still, waiting for the next hand that knows how to read them. A staff is not a weapon in the way a sword is a weapon. It does not cut, it does not pierce, it does not rely on the strength of the arm holding it or the sharpness of an edge. What it relies on is something harder to see: a relationship between the wood, the enchantment inside it, and the person channeling through it. Mages who have spent their lives working with staves describe the experience differently than fighters describe carrying a blade. A blade is an extension of the body. A staff is more like a door. Tonight we move through what that means and what it has meant across the long history of magical arms in Skyrim. The wood used to make a staff is not chosen randomly. Different wood types carry different affinities, natural tendencies towards certain kinds of magical interaction that exist in the material before any enchantment is ever applied. A staff carved from heartwood found near active magical sites absorbs ambient magicka differently than one carved from ordinary forest timber. Enchanters who specialize in staff construction spend years learning which wood responds to which school of magic and why. The enchantment applied to the finished staff works with these natural properties rather than against them. A staff built from wood with a natural frost affinity will carry a frost enchantment more cleanly and more durably than one built from wood with no particular tendency. The wood is not passive in this process. It is a participant. The conduit shapes what passes through it, and what passes through it shapes the conduit in return. The skull of corruption does not use soul gems. It does not draw on stored energy or bound spirits or any of the conventional mechanisms that power enchanted objects. What it draws on is dreams. Specifically, the dreams of people sleeping nearby. While the skull is present, it quietly pulls something from the sleeping minds around it. Not enough to harm them, not enough to wake them, but enough to accumulate. That accumulated dream energy is what powers the staff when it is used. Vermina, the Daedric prince of nightmares and memory, created it this way deliberately. A weapon powered by sleeping minds reflects her domain exactly. The people who fuel it never know they are doing so. They sleep, they dream, and somewhere nearby, something is feeding on what their resting minds produce. The skull has never needed to ask permission for any of it. The staff of Magnus was not made by Magnus. That distinction matters more than it might first seem. Magnus was the god of magic, the architect of the rules by which magicka flows through the world. He did not craft the staff that carries his name. A mage did. A mortal who had spent so long studying Magnus's writings, tracing the patterns of his influence, that something in the staff they were constructing began to respond. The staff started absorbing ambient magicka on its own, without any formal enchantment being applied to make it do so. The mage had not intended this. They were building a tool. What they built instead was something that had learned a behavior from proximity to so much accumulated knowledge about its namesake. Whether that makes the staff of Magnus a tribute, an accident, or something else entirely depends on how you think about the relationship between study and the thing being studied. Paralysis staves were restricted in multiple holds across Skyrim's history. The reasons given in official records focus on public safety, but the actual pattern of incidents that prompted those restrictions tells a more specific story. The staves were not being used to harm people. They were being used to stop people temporarily long enough to move them, restrain them, or remove property from their possession while they were unable to respond. A paralyzed person is not dead. They are simply unable to act for a period. That window was exploited systematically enough that several holds eventually decided the staves were more useful to criminals than to anyone else. The restriction did not eliminate the problem. Paralysis staves are not difficult to make, and people who wanted them continued to acquire them. But the official position in those holds made carrying one a declaration of intent that required justification. The imperial classification system draws a legal line between staves and weapons. A staff is an arcane tool. A sword is an arm. The distinction sounds technical, but it has practical consequences that have played out across centuries of imperial governance. Arms are subject to carry restrictions, confiscation protocols, and rules of engagement that arcane tools are not. A mage walking into a city with a staff does not trigger the same legal response as a warrior walking in with a drawn blade. Enchanters and mages have been aware of this distinction for as long as it has existed. Some have used it deliberately, carrying staves into situations where weapons would have been challenged. The classification was not designed to create that loophole, but it created it anyway, and the people who benefited from it were careful never to draw too much attention to the fact. In early Skyrim history, a mage carrying a staff was understood to be making a statement about their intentions. The staff was a signal. It said that the bearer was present in a learned capacity as an advisor, a healer, a researcher, or a scholar, not as a combatant. Warriors read this signal and adjusted their behavior accordingly. A staff bearer who arrived at a negotiation, a gathering, or a disputed location was extended a form of consideration that an armed fighter would not necessarily receive. This convention was not written into any law. It was a cultural understanding, informal and unenforceable. Like most informal understandings, it worked until it did not. Mages who recognized the protection the convention offered began using staves in situations that tested its limits. Eventually, the signal lost some of its clarity, but in the early period, it was reliable enough that many mages owed their survival to it. There are staves in ancient ruins that no living mage has been able to replicate, not in terms of power, in terms of method. The enchantments on these staves do not follow the theoretical frameworks that current magical scholarship uses to understand how staves work. They produce effects that fit within known magical categories, but arrive there through processes that cannot be reverse engineered from examining the finished object. The knowledge of how they were made did not survive whoever made them. It may have been deliberately protected, kept within a closed tradition that ended when the people practicing it ended. Or it may have simply been lost the way most knowledge is lost, gradually, through the death of individuals who never thought to write down what they knew. The staves remain. The method is gone, and the gap between the object and the understanding of it grows wider as the years pass. The wood used in Hagraven staves behaves differently than any other wood studied by researchers who have examined it. In controlled conditions, samples of this wood show a consistent directional tendency. They bend toward bone, they bend away from stone. Not dramatically, the movement is slow and slight, but it is repeatable and consistent enough to have been documented by multiple researchers working independently. No explanation has been proposed that accounts for this behavior within normal botanical frameworks. The wood is not alive in the conventional sense by the time it is used in a staff, but it responds to its environment as if some quality of the tree it came from persists in the material. Hagravens who use this wood for their staves have never offered an explanation to outside researchers. They have not been asked in ways that produced answers. The wood does what it does, and the question of why sits unanswered in the same place it has always sat. Mages carried staves because the staff was the right tool for what they did, not because it was safer than a sword or more impressive than a dagger, because it fit the relationship between a mage and their power, something to channel through rather than something to swing. The weapon suited the person. And in Skyrim, where the right tool has always mattered more than appearances, that was reason enough. Not all metals are equal in Tamriel. Not all of them are simply metals. Some carry history inside them. Some carry properties that have nothing to do with hardness or edge retention, or how they respond to a hammer. The choice of material in Skyrim's weapon tradition was never purely practical. It was cultural, spiritual, and sometimes geological, in ways that take a long time to fully understand. Tonight we move through the materials, what they are, where they came from, and what they meant to the people who shaped them into weapons. Silver does something to werewolves and certain undead that other metals do not. This is confirmed across enough independent accounts that it is not treated as theory. Silver disrupts the physical form of these beings in a way that ordinary iron or steel cannot. The wound from a silver blade does not close the same way. The disruption it causes goes past the physical damage and interferes with whatever holds the transformed state together. No one has produced a fully satisfying explanation of why this is the case at a mechanical level. The best current understanding involves silver's natural resistance to certain kinds of magical alteration, a property it carries independent of any enchantment. It is not that silver is sharper or stronger. It is that silver is, in some fundamental way, incompatible with the forces that produce the werewolf state. The metal and the condition refuse to coexist cleanly. Ebony ore is not a natural mineral in the way iron or copper is natural. The accounts that address its origin consistently point to the same source. Lorcan, the god whose death or sacrifice created the mortal world, depending on which tradition is telling the story, bled. That blood soaked into the earth over immeasurable time. It crystallized. What emerged from that process is what smiths now call ebony. The material carries the weight of that origin in ways that researchers have noted without being able to fully quantify. Ebony weapons feel different to carry than their mass alone would suggest. The density is real, but the feeling of weight that experienced warriors report goes beyond what the scales show. Whether that is a psychological response to knowing the origin, or something the material carries in a more literal sense, is a question that has not been resolved. Moonstone arrived in Tamriel with the Aldmer. It was the first metal they worked after crossing from their original homeland. Before iron, before steel, before any of the alloys that later races would develop moonstone, the Aldmer shaped it into tools and eventually into weapons, and the practice of working it became embedded in elven metalworking culture so deeply that it persisted through every era and every migration that followed. Modern elven weapons still incorporate moonstone. The association between the material and elven craft is not simply tradition. It is the oldest continuous metalworking relationship in Tamrielic history. When an elven smith works moonstone today, they are participating in something that has been unbroken for longer than most civilizations have existed. That continuity is part of what the material carries. It is heavier with history than its weight suggests. Steel is a Nordic development. The combination of iron with the right proportion of carbon, refined through a process that produces a significantly stronger and more durable material than iron alone. This was worked out in the cold north of Tamriel and carried south from there. The Nords did not publicize this. They did not trade the knowledge freely. It spread the way most practical knowledge spreads, through contact, through observation, through people watching how Nordic weapons performed and attempting to understand why. By the time steel was in common use across Tamriel, most people had forgotten or never known where the development originated. The Nords never made a significant effort to reclaim that credit. They moved on to other problems. But the material that most of Tamriel's smiths consider fundamental to their craft came from the north, from a cold place, from people who needed something that would not fail them in difficult conditions. Orichalcum is the heaviest practical weapon metal in common use in Tamriel. Weapons made from it, orcish blades, orcish warhammers, orcish axes, are consistently heavier than comparable weapons made from other materials. This is not a failure of design. It is a consequence of the metal's density, which no smithing process has found a way to reduce without changing the material's other properties. Orcish smiths work within this constraint and have done so for generations. The weight of an orcish weapon is treated as a feature, not a limitation. A heavier weapon, properly used, carries more force into the strike. The warrior who can use that weight effectively hits harder than a warrior using a lighter blade. The orcish weapon tradition has always been built around producing warriors capable of using the weight rather than reducing the metal to accommodate warriors who cannot. Quicksilver is found in only a small number of locations in Skyrim. The deposits are not evenly distributed. They are not abundant. Elven smiths who use quicksilver in weapon construction have always worked with a constrained supply, and that constraint has shaped the tradition around elven weaponry in ways that are visible in the finished objects. Elven weapons are not mass-produced. They are made carefully, in smaller quantities, with attention to every component, because the scarcity of the primary material demands it. The expense of elven gear in the market reflects this directly. It is not that the craft is intentionally exclusive. It is that the material that makes the craft possible is genuinely limited, and limited materials produce limited output. What is produced is made with more care than a material in abundant supply would typically receive. Stalrim is cold. That much is obvious to anyone who has held it. But the cold it produces is not a temperature. It does not respond to heat the way frozen material should. You can bring Stalrim near a fire, and the fire will not warm it. The cold is not physical. It is a property of what the material is, not what temperature it happens to be. Stalrim is the crystallized remains of ancient burial magic. The burial practices used in a specific period of Skyrim's history involved enchantments placed on the body and the surrounding material that were meant to preserve and protect. Over an immense span of time, that magical preservation solidified into the material itself. The cold that radiates from Stalrim is the residue of those ancient wards, not ice, not temperature, something older than either, preserved in a form that has outlasted the civilization that created it. Nordic smiths believed that speaking an enemy's name while working the metal gave the weapon a direction, not through any formal enchanting process, not through soul gems or spell application, just through the act of naming, of introducing a specific intention into the work while the metal was still being shaped. The belief was that metal, while it is being formed, is receptive. It has not yet decided what it is. Speaking into that moment of openness introduced a quality that the finished weapon would carry. Whether this produced any measurable effect on the blade's performance is not something that can be tested now, but the practice was widespread enough to have been documented by multiple observers across multiple eras, and the smiths who used it were consistent in their belief that it worked. That consistency is worth noting, even if the mechanism behind it remains unclear. Dragon bones do not behave like mortal bones. Mortal bone loses density over time. It calcifies, becomes brittle, loses the flexibility that made it functional in life. Dragon bones do not follow this process. They remain dense and flexible and structurally intact, regardless of age. Weapons made from dragon bone are heavier than Daedric weapons and more durable than ebony. The material does not degrade in normal conditions. It does not respond to the environmental processes that eventually compromise every other weapon material. A dragonbone blade made today will be in the same condition in 1,000 years, assuming it is not physically destroyed. The bones came from creatures that were effectively immortal. It should not be surprising that the material carries something of that quality forward. The weapon made from a dragon is, in some sense, still participating in what the dragon was. The metal a weapon is made from is never just a technical choice. Every material in this chapter carried something beyond its physical properties, a history, a meaning, a connection to something larger than the blade itself. The smiths, who chose their materials, carefully understood that. They were not just building tools, they were building statements about what they believed the world was made of. The deepest parts of Skyrim do not look like Skyrim. No sky, no wind, no snow falling through cold air, just stone and dark and the sound of things moving that have not seen light in generations. The weapons made down here follow different rules. They were built for a world that exists completely below the surface, a world with its own logic, its own materials, and its own long history of violence that the surface rarely thinks about. Tonight we go down into it. The Falmer were not always what they are now. Before the Dwemer found them, before the enslavement and the forced consumption of toxic fungi that destroyed their sight, the Snow Elves were a sophisticated civilization. They built structures, they made art, they had a relationship with the world that bore no resemblance to the crude, aggressive beings that move through Dwemer ruins today. Their current weapons, rough, unrefined, effective only in the most basic sense, are a measure of how completely that civilization was dismantled. Every crude blade a Falmer carries is evidence of what was taken from them, not just freedom and sight and culture, the ability to make anything better than this. The gap between what the Snow Elves were and what the Falmer became is one of the quieter tragedies in Skyrim's history. The weapons mark it clearly. Falmer weapons are made from Chorus chitin. The Chorus is not simply a creature the Falmer encounter underground, it is something they manage. The Falmer maintain Chorus populations in controlled environments deep beneath the surface. They cultivate them, they harvest them. The relationship between the Falmer and the Chorus is one of the few organized activities that survived the collapse of Snow Elf civilization intact. When a Chorus matures and is harvested, its exoskeleton provides the primary material for Falmer arms and armor. The chitin is harder than it looks and holds a shaped edge better than most surface dwellers would expect from an insect material. The Falmer have been working with it long enough to understand exactly how to shape it and where its limits are. What looks primitive from the outside is actually the result of generations of accumulated knowledge about a specific material in a specific environment. Some Falmer shamans carry staves made from bones that do not match any creature that has been catalogued underground. The bones are too large for Chorus, too dense for anything identified in the deeper cave systems. Researchers who have examined these staves describe the bone material as unlike anything in the known fauna of Blackreach or the surrounding deep ruins. Where the Falmer obtained it is not documented anywhere. Whether the creatures these bones came from still exist somewhere further down in parts of the underground that have not been explored, or whether they are remnants of something that no longer lives, is an open question. The shamans who carry these staves have not provided information that clarifies the matter. The bones are there. The creature is not accounted for. That gap has not been closed. Certain weapon caches discovered inside sealed Dwemer ruins contain weapons that are different from standard Dwemer production. They are sealed behind resonance locks mechanisms that respond to specific vibration frequencies rather than physical keys. The weapons inside are coated in a substance that has resisted identification. It is not rust. It is not a known preservative compound. It adheres to the metal uniformly, does not respond to standard cleaning processes, and does not appear to have degraded over the centuries the caches have been sealed. What it was applied for protection, enhancement, some other purpose entirely, is not explained in any Dwemer text that has been recovered and translated. The caches are among the more unusual finds in Dwemer archaeological work, not because of what is known about them, because of how much is not. Chaurus poison works differently than most venoms. The specific adaptation that makes it notable is directional. It is particularly effective against targets arriving from above, in bright conditions. The blinding effect it produces is most acute when the target moves from a lit environment into the darker underground spaces the Falmer inhabit. A surface dweller descending into Falmer territory, moving from daylight into dark, is maximally vulnerable to this specific poison effect. That is not a coincidence. The Chorus developed in an environment where the primary threats came from above. The poison evolved to address those threats. The Falmer, who harvest and use the Chorus, benefit from this adaptation without having engineered it. The underground produced exactly the biological weapon most useful for defending it, and the Falmer had the knowledge to apply it. In the ruins beneath Blackreach, there are weapon fragments that do not appear in any Dwemer catalogue that has been compiled by researchers. They are smaller than standard Dwemer weapons, lighter. The proportions suggest they were made for hands, significantly smaller than a Dwemer adult's. The metalwork is consistent with Dwemer technique in terms of material and basic construction, but the scale is wrong for any known Dwemer population. No historical record documents a smaller Dwemer subgroup or a client race that would account for these dimensions. The fragments are too deliberate and too consistent to be children's items or decorative objects. They were functional weapons, made by Dwemer methods, for hands that should not exist in the historical record. That inconsistency has not been resolved. The Falmer were once known for archery. The Snow Elves, in the period before Dwemer contact, used bows with a level of skill that matched the most capable archers on the surface. That capability is completely absent in the Falmer today. The weapons they carry now are close range, designed for the confined spaces of tunnel combat, not for precision shooting across any distance. The loss of their eyesight is the direct cause. Precision archery requires the ability to see a target clearly at range. Without that, the entire skill set becomes inaccessible. What replaced it, the crude blades and chitin weapons, are not a choice, they are a consequence. The Falmer did not decide to stop being archers. They lost the ability to be archers when they lost the ability to see. Everything that followed was adaptation to a condition they did not choose. There are weapons embedded in the walls of certain underground caves, not placed there, not dropped and covered over time. Embedded, the metal is inside the stone, surrounded by it, as if the rock formed around the weapon after it was already there. The geological process that would produce this naturally would require the weapon to predate the stone formation, which in most cases would place the weapon far beyond any known period of weapon production in Tamriel. The alternative explanations, magical encasement, deliberate placement through unknown means, something about the cave environment that causes metal to migrate into stone under specific conditions, are all speculative. The weapons are there, the stone is around them, and the explanation for how that happened has not been found in any source examined so far. The deep places remember things that the surface has moved past. The weapons down here are older than most of what is carried above ground, stranger in their origins, and more honest about the conditions that produced them. Nothing made underground had the luxury of being decorative. Everything down here was made because something down here required it. Most weapons in Skyrim do not have names. They are made, used, worn down, and eventually discarded or buried without anyone recording what they were called if they were called anything at all. The ones that earn names are different. Something happened with them, or to them, or through them, that made the name necessary. A name is a form of memory. It says that this particular object, out of all the objects that have existed, is worth remembering individually. Tonight we move through the ones that earned that distinction. Chilrend is older than the person who owns it when you first encounter it in Skyrim. The blue glass blade and its frost enchantment were not made by its current keeper. They predate that ownership by several generations. The blade passed through multiple hands before arriving where it sits, and each transfer added another layer to what the weapon represents, not just a tool, but a thing that has outlasted everyone who thought they owned it. Glass weapons of that quality were not common even in the era when Chilrend was first made. The enchantment on it is old enough that the style of binding differs slightly from current practice. Someone in an earlier generation understood something about frost enchantment that the blade still demonstrates, quietly, to anyone who examines it carefully enough. Red Eagle made a condition. His sword would not simply be left in a tomb for whoever happened to find it. The blade would wait sealed away, inaccessible, until someone came who was willing to do a specific thing, not defeat a specific enemy, not prove a particular kind of strength. Light the funeral pyre. That was the condition. Red Eagle died without the burial his tradition required, and the sword was placed in a tomb with the understanding that it would remain there until someone honored what had been left undone. The weapon is tied to an act of respect, not an act of combat. Whoever carries it out of that tomb has not conquered anything. They have completed something that was left unfinished. That is a different relationship between a warrior and a blade than most named weapons involve. Windshear is a scimitar. It is also one of the most unusually located weapons in Skyrim. To reach it, a person must climb out onto the bowsprit of a specific ship, a projecting spar at the front of the vessel, extending out over open water. There is no quest that leads there, no marker, no indication that anything worthwhile is at the end of that particular climb. Most people who board the ship never go to the bowsprit at all. The weapon simply sits there, held in place, visible only to someone who has already decided to go somewhere that most people would not think to go. How it came to be there is not recorded anywhere in the texts connected to it. Someone placed it in that specific location and walked away without explaining why. The blade is real, the location is precise, the reasoning behind the placement is gone. Harkon's sword was made for one purpose, not for general combat, not for the kind of fighting that most swords are designed to handle. It was built specifically to allow a vampire lord to channel the abilities of that form directly into a physical strike. The sword is an interface, a way of taking power that exists in a transformed state and expressing it through a conventional weapon. Most vampire lords, who have the ability to assume that form, do not also carry swords. The sword is redundant for them in most situations. Harkon built one anyway, because what it produces is different from what the transformed abilities produce on their own. The combination of physical blade and channeled vampire lord power creates something neither achieves separately. That specificity of purpose makes it one of the more precisely designed weapons in Skyrim's catalogue of unusual arms. The pale blade carries a frost enchantment. That much is clear to anyone who picks it up. What is not clear, what no surviving record addresses, is who made it, or why it ended up in the specific ruin where it waits. The enchantment is old. The style of the binding suggests a period significantly earlier than most of the other enchanted weapons that have been catalogued. Someone made this blade with considerable skill, placed it in a location that would eventually become infested with Falmer, and left no documentation of any of it. The weapon did not arrive there by accident. Weapons of that quality and age do not simply drift into Falmer ruins. Someone carried it there, or left it there, or placed it there with intention. What that intention was has not been recovered from any source. Grimsever is a glass sword. It was enchanted by a mage who apparently did not want the enchantment formula to be accessible. The formula was not recorded in the weapon itself, as many enchanters do, noting the binding method in a way that allows the enchantment to be studied later. Instead, it was written in a separate journal that the mage locked and stored away from the weapon. Whether this was for protection, for privacy, or because the mage intended to return for it and simply never did, is not clear. The weapon and the journal ended up separated. The sword remained. The journal's location became obscure. Anyone who examined Grimsever could see what the enchantment did. How it was done remained in a locked book that the sword's maker apparently never came back to retrieve. Dawnfang and Duskfang are the same blade. During the day, it carries one enchantment. At night, it carries another. The transition happens without any action from the wielder. The blade shifts on its own as the light changes. The origin of this property lies in the Shivering Isles, in a deal made during the Oblivion Crisis with a merchant Daedra whose speciality was unusual transactions. The blade was not made to be the most powerful weapon available. It was made to be interesting. The merchant who produced it appears to have been more invested in the novelty of a blade that changes than in optimizing either of the enchantments it carries. The result is a weapon that is genuinely unusual in a way that utility-focused design would never produce, because utility-focused design would never have bothered. The Ebony Warrior carries a sword called the Sword of Ancient Tongues. Most fighters who face the Ebony Warrior focus on surviving the encounter. The sword itself receives less attention, but the sword was designed specifically for this context, for the encounter at the end of a Dragonborn's journey, after everything else has been faced and overcome. It was not made to be found early. It was not made to be useful for the middle portion of a warrior's life. It was made to be the weapon standing across from a Dragonborn at the moment when the Dragonborn has become everything they are going to be. The blade is a marker, not just a weapon. It measures the end of a journey by appearing at it. Bola's Oathblade was left behind on purpose. The blade who carried it fled to a remote shrine after the Great War, after the blades were hunted and scattered and reduced from what they had been to something much smaller. He lived there. He died there. And before he died, he placed the blade at the shrine, rather than keeping it with him, not because he could no longer use it, because he wanted it to stay. The blade was a tribute to what the blades had been left in a place that still mattered to the tradition by someone who had nowhere else to take it. A weapon used as a memorial is a different kind of object than a weapon used as a tool. The Oathblade has been both. At the shrine, it is only the second thing. And that, for the man who left it there, was enough. Named weapons carry more than metal. They carry the decisions made around them, who kept them, who left them, what conditions were attached to them, and what they were used to say when words were not enough. The name is never just a name. It is a record of everything the blade passed through to earn it. The Imperial Legion did not think about weapons the way most warriors did. A warrior thinks about their blade personally, what it feels like in their hand, how it balances, what it has been through with them, what it means to carry it. The Legion did not think this way. The Legion thought about weapons, the way it thought about roads and walls and supply lines as systems, as infrastructure, as components of something much larger than any individual who carried them. A weapon was not a personal object inside the Legion. It was a part that needed to function reliably within a machine that depended on every other part functioning reliably at the same time. That philosophy produced a weapon culture unlike anything else in Skyrim's history. Not the most personal tradition, not the one that produces named blades and burial rites and stories told around fires for generations, but possibly the most durable tradition on the continent. Tonight we move through what the Legion built, why they built it that way, and what it left behind in the cold north long after the people who built it were gone. Imperial swords are shorter than Nordic longswords, not by accident, not because Imperial smiths lacked the skill or the material to produce a longer blade. The difference was decided deliberately during a period in the Second Era when Legion commanders were studying formation combat seriously and identifying exactly what was working and what was consistently failing. The problem with a long blade in tight formation is not complicated once you have seen it. When soldiers stand close together, shields overlapping, shoulders pressed against the person beside them, bodies locked into the line, a long sword has nowhere to go on the draw. It catches. It drags against the soldier next to you. It requires a half step back to clear for a swing, and a half step back in a tight formation breaks the integrity of the line at exactly the moment when the line needs to hold. A shorter blade draws cleanly from a tight stance. It thrusts forward without requiring the elbow to clear a wide arc. It works in the specific conditions that Legion combat most reliably produced: close, locked, disciplined engagements with very little room to move laterally and no room at all to take a full step back. The shorter sword was not a compromise between what the Legion wanted and what was practical. It was a precise solution to a specific problem that longer blades consistently and demonstrably failed to solve in formation conditions. The commanders who made the decision documented their reasoning. The decision held: broken Imperial weapons were not discarded. The Legion ran on efficiency, and efficiency in a military organization meant that nothing with remaining material value was simply thrown away because it had stopped serving its original function. When a blade cracked, bent beyond what could be straightened at a field forge, or broke at the tang from sustained combat stress, it went back into the system. The metal was collected, transported to the nearest garrison forge, melted down, and reforged, not into another sword, but into shield reinforcements, rim banding, structural backing plates, the internal bracework that kept a shield from splitting under repeated impacts, the cross-bracing inside a scutum that distributed force across the whole surface, rather than concentrating it at the point of impact. A sword that could no longer function as a sword could still function as the material that kept a shield together through another full campaign season. This recycling process was not informal or left to individual garrison commanders to manage as they saw fit. It was documented and centrally tracked. Garrison records from several Imperial forts in Skyrim include specific inventory entries that note damaged weapons received from the field, metal weight recovered from the smelting process, and shield components produced from that recovered material. Every step was written down. The Legion accounted for every piece of metal it controlled and found a productive use for all of it. Nothing was wasted because the system had been designed specifically to prevent waste. The rank of Blade Master existed within the Imperial Legion for one purpose and one purpose only. It was not a combat rank. It carried no command authority over soldiers or units. It was an oversight role, a position held by a specialist whose entire professional responsibility was the inspection, maintenance, assessment, and certification of the weapons carried by officers within their assigned command. Legate-ranked officers did not simply carry whatever sword they preferred or could afford to commission privately. Their weapons were formally reviewed on a schedule. A blade master examined each blade for structural integrity from tang to tip, for balance relative to the standard specification, for edge condition and the quality of the grind, for the security of the grip and the pommel assembly, and for any signs of stress or fatigue in the metal that might not be visible at a glance, but would become relevant under sustained combat loading. A weapon that did not meet the standard was returned before it was cleared for duty. The officer carried a replacement from Legion inventory until their own blade was corrected and re-inspected. The Blade Master also assessed weapons after significant combat operations, checking for damage that looked minor but would affect performance in the next engagement, in ways the officer carrying the blade might not notice until a critical moment. The position reflected something the Legion understood clearly, and that individual warriors sometimes did not. A weapon that looks fine and a weapon that actually is fine are not always the same thing. The difference between those two states is exactly what the Blade Master existed to identify. The Imperial short sword pattern established during the Septim Empire has not changed in any meaningful way in over 400 years. That is not an oversight or an institutional failure to consider alternatives. It is a position that has been actively reaffirmed across multiple eras, multiple Legion commanders, and multiple periods of significant political and military change. When a design genuinely works, when it performs reliably and consistently in the conditions it was made for, when it can be produced to the same specification across dozens of garrison forges spread across multiple provinces, when a legionnaire who has trained with it in Cyrodiil can pick up a replacement blade at a garrison in Skyrim and feel no meaningful difference in weight, balance, or handling, there is no practical justification for change. The same design being used, is not evidence of stagnation. It is evidence that the design solved the problem it was created to solve and has continued to solve it. New designs were proposed at various points across the 4 centuries since the pattern was established. Most were evaluated through formal Legion review processes and set aside. A small number produced minor refinements that were absorbed into the standard gradually without altering its essential character or requiring retraining. The sword a legionnaire carries in the 4th era is recognizably the same object in all the ways that matter operationally as the sword carried by a legionnaire during the height of Septim rule. The Legion maintained that continuity on purpose because the continuity served a real function inside a system that depended on predictability. Every Imperial weapon produced at a garrison forge carries a small stamp near the base of the blade. The location of the stamp is standardized, always in the same position relative to the crossguard, always pressed into the metal at the same depth, always using the same format of identifying code. The stamp is not decorative, and it carries no ceremonial meaning. It is an identification mark that records which garrison forge produced the weapon, during which production period, and under the oversight of which certified blade master. The system existed for reasons that were entirely practical. If a batch of weapons showed a consistent defect, a flaw, in the metal composition from a specific ore source, a problem with the tempering process during a particular production run, a structural weakness in the grip construction that appeared across multiple units from the same batch, the stamp allowed the Legion to identify every weapon from that production run and address the problem systematically before it caused a failure at a moment when failure was unacceptable. The stamp system also allowed the Legion to track weapons that left the inventory without authorization. A stamped weapon found in the possession of someone who should not have it could be traced back through the record system to the exact point where it left Legion control. The stamp turned every blade into a document. The Legion kept very careful documents. Auxiliary forces attached to the Imperial Legion were issued crossbows as their standard ranged weapon. The crossbows issued to auxiliaries were not the same quality as the weapons carried by regular legionnaires or by officers. The difference was deliberate, and it was policy, not the result of budget inconsistency or supply problems. The reasoning behind the policy was stated plainly in Legion administrative documents from the relevant period. A deserter who left with their issued weapon represented a security concern. The degree of that concern was directly proportional to how effective the weapon was. A low-quality crossbow in the hands of someone who had left the Legion without authorization was a manageable and relatively contained problem. A high-quality precision weapon in the hands of someone who had left with grievances, who knew Legion patrol patterns, who understood garrison schedules and supply routes, was a meaningfully different threat. The policy kept the auxiliary crossbow functional enough to be useful in the field, while ensuring that its usefulness had a ceiling that served the Legion's interests in the event of desertion. The policy was not popular with auxiliaries who understood what the quality difference implied about how the Legion viewed them. Several documented complaints from auxiliary units in Skyrim specifically mention the discrepancy. The Legion acknowledged the complaints formally in each case. The policy did not change. The logic of the system, as it always did within the Legion, outweighed the feelings of the individuals operating inside it. After the Great War ended and the White Gold Concordat was signed, the Imperial Legion in Skyrim began quietly phasing out the issuance of silver weapons from its standard inventory. Silver arms had been part of Legion equipment for a significant period. They were useful against specific categories of threat that conventional iron or steel could not address with the same effectiveness, and Skyrim presented those threats in meaningful numbers. The official explanation given for the withdrawal was cost. Silver is substantially more expensive than standard weapon metals, and a Legion that had just emerged from an exhausting and costly war accepted a peace that included significant political concessions and was operating with reduced resources in a northern province, had legitimate financial reasons to reassess what it was spending on specialized inventory. The official explanation is not false. It is also not the complete picture available from the surviving record. The timing of the silver weapon withdrawal corresponds with a period during which internal Legion records show investigations into several units that had reported unexplained troop losses in circumstances that did not fit encounters with conventional human enemies. The nature of those losses, as described in the investigation records that survive, involve details that the investigating officers found difficult to account for through standard explanations. What the investigations concluded, if they concluded anything formally, is not preserved in any document that has been recovered. The silver weapons stopped being issued. The investigations were closed. The relationship between those two events sits in the record as a coincidence that has not been confirmed as anything more, and has not been convincingly explained as anything less. Some Imperial weapons recovered from the early Fourth Era, the period covering the civil conflict between the Imperial Legion and the Stormcloak Uprising in Skyrim, carry inscriptions that do not appear in any standard Imperial marking system. The inscriptions are short. They follow a consistent format across weapons recovered from multiple different locations that had no obvious connection to each other. The characters used are not standard Imperial script, and they do not correspond to any provincial writing system that researchers have been able to match them to. The leading interpretation among those who have studied these weapons is that the inscriptions represent a cipher, an encoded identification system applied to specific weapons for a purpose that the standard garrison stamp system was not designed to serve. The most commonly accepted explanation is that these were loyalty markers, a covert way of tracking which weapons had been issued to specific units or individuals whose reliability was being quietly monitored during a period when the Legion's internal cohesion in Skyrim was under serious pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. A legionnaire who received a cipher-marked blade had no way of knowing what the mark meant, or that it was there at all, unless they knew specifically what to look for. The people maintaining the tracking system would have known exactly what it meant and where every marked weapon was supposed to be, whether the system functioned as intended, whether it identified what it was designed to identify, and whether it was still being maintained at the end of the conflict, are questions that the surviving record does not answer. The marks are there. The system that created them dissolved with the end of the war. What remains is the inscription on the metal and the knowledge that someone in a position of authority during a difficult and uncertain period thought the system was necessary enough to implement it quietly and maintain it carefully. The Legion left its shape on Skyrim in ways that are still there, in the roads that cross the province, in the forts that sit on the high passes, in the administrative patterns that the holds absorbed and kept long after the political arrangements around them changed. The weapons are part of that shape, too less visible than the roads, but just as consistent. 400 years of the same sword, the same stamp pressed into the same location on every blade, the same careful accounting for every piece of metal that entered the system and every piece that left it. An empire approaches weapons the way it approaches everything else, as a problem of scale and duration, not of individual expression. What it built in Skyrim, it built to function after the people who built it were gone. In that specific ambition, at least, it largely succeeded. In an orcish stronghold, the forge is never quiet. Not because the work is loud though it is, not because the hammers ring through the settlement at all hours though they do, but because silence at the forge is considered wrong, not uncomfortable, not unusual. Wrong. A smith who works without singing is a smith whose work cannot be trusted. The song is not background noise. It is part of the process. And in a tradition where the process is everything, that distinction matters more than it might seem from the outside. Tonight, we move into the forge culture of the Orsimer, into the philosophy, the obligations, the debts, and the deep relationship between orcish weapon making and the god who watches over all of it. This is not a simple tradition. It is one of the most structured and demanding weapon cultures in all of Tamriel, built over generations by people who believe that how a weapon is made is just as important as what it can do. Orcish smiths sing while they work. This is not a casual habit or a cultural quirk that developed without meaning. The song is functional. What a smith sings while forging determines, within the tradition, which warrior the weapon is being made for. Different songs carry different qualities, different rhythms, different tonal ranges, different histories attached to the words. A smith who knows the warrior they are making for selects a song that fits that warrior, their history, their fighting style, the kinds of battles they have already survived and the kinds they are likely to face. The song runs through the entire process, from the first heating of the metal to the final edgework. It does not stop while the smith rests. When the smith sets down the hammer, the song pauses. When they pick it up again, the song continues from where it left off. By the time the weapon is finished, the song has been sung in full, sometimes multiple times, and the weapon has been made inside it from beginning to end. Orcish smiths, who have been asked to explain what the song does to the metal, describe it differently depending on who is asking. To outsiders, they tend to say that it focuses the work. To other orcs, they say something closer to the truth, that the weapon learns who it belongs to before it ever leaves the forge. Every weapon made inside a stronghold begins the same way. The first strike of the hammer is not for the warrior who commissioned the weapon. It is not for the smith who is making it. It is for Malakath. That dedication is spoken aloud, a short, direct statement that the first blow belongs to him and that everything made after it is made under his witness. The dedication is not optional. A weapon whose first strike was not dedicated to Malakath is not considered a proper weapon within the tradition. It can be used, it will function, but it carries a quality of incompleteness that Orcish warriors take seriously. Malakath is not a passive figure in Orcish weapon culture. He is an active presence, someone the tradition is in constant communication with through the act of making. Every blade struck in a stronghold is technically an offering first and a tool second. The warrior who eventually carries it receives something that has already been given to something larger than either of them. That sequence, Malakath first, warrior second, is the foundation everything else in the tradition is built on. An orc who loses a weapon in battle is expected to go back for it. Not immediately, not while the battle is still happening and recovery is impossible, but after, when the ground can be safely returned to, when the site can be reached and searched, the weapon is expected to come home, leaving it permanently on a battlefield, in the hands of an enemy, in a river, in a ruin. Abandoning it, in any permanent sense, is not treated as an unfortunate outcome of combat. It is treated as a failure of responsibility. The failure is not only the warrior's, it reflects on the smith who made the weapon. A blade that cannot be recovered means a blade that has been permanently separated from the person it was made for and the forge it came from. The smith's work is out in the world, unaccounted for, carrying the forge's mark in a context the forge did not intend. Orcish smiths take this personally. There are accounts of smiths who refused to make a second weapon for a warrior who had not recovered a lost first one. The message in that refusal is specific. You were trusted with something that was made for you. You have not finished your obligation to it yet. Come back when you have. The spikes on Orcish warhammers are not there for visual effect. They are not decorative additions made to make the weapon look more threatening. Each spike on a traditionally made Orcish warhammer represents a debt that the warrior carried at the time the weapon was commissioned. Not a financial debt, specifically, though financial debts can be included. A debt in the broader Orcish sense, an obligation owed, something that has not yet been settled between the warrior and another person, or between the warrior and Malakath, or between the warrior and their own history. The number of spikes is determined in a conversation between the warrior and the smith before the forging begins. The warrior accounts for their outstanding obligations honestly. The smith listens. The spikes are added accordingly. A warrior who carries a hammer with many spikes is not seen as burdened. They are seen as honest someone who knows what they owe and has not pretended otherwise. The hammer is a public record of that accounting. Every orc who sees it knows something true about the person carrying it. Malakath's code is not written down anywhere. That is not an oversight. The code exists in the way it has always existed, passed from smith to smith, from chief to warrior, from parent to child, through direct transmission rather than documentation. It covers how weapons are given between orcs, how they are traded, how they pass from one generation to the next when a warrior dies, and what obligations attach to a weapon at each stage of that passage. The rules are specific, and they are numerous, but none of them appear in any text. An outsider who wanted to understand the code would need to spend a significant amount of time inside a stronghold, asking careful questions, and earning the kind of trust that makes honest answers possible. Breaking the code carries consequences that the stronghold administers without external involvement. Exile is the most commonly documented outcome for serious violations, not execution, not combat. Exile removal from the community and from the protections the community provides. In a culture where belonging to a stronghold is the foundation of a functional life, exile is a serious enough consequence that most violations of the code are minor ones made by people who did not fully understand what they were doing. The ones who understand the code and break it anyway are rare. The consequences for them tend to be applied without discussion. The area near the grip on a traditionally finished orcish blade is left rough. This is intentional and it is specific. The roughness is not a result of incomplete finishing work. An orcish smith who wanted a smooth surface there could produce one. The rough texture is left because it serves a purpose that a smooth surface cannot. During extended combat, a warrior's hand bleeds. Grip injuries are common, cuts from the crossguard, abrasions from the rough handling of a long fight, reopened old wounds. Blood gets onto the grip. On a smooth-surfaced grip, blood is a hazard. It reduces friction and makes the weapon harder to control. On the rough surface of a traditional orcish blade grip, the blood is absorbed into the texture. It fills the small irregularities in the surface, and over time, dries into them. The grip becomes saturated with the specific blood of the specific warrior who carries it. After enough use, the grip has been altered by that accumulation. It fits the warrior's hand more precisely than it fit anyone else's hand. The weapon and the person have been physically bonded through the material evidence of every fight they have shared. Orcish smiths describe this as the weapon learning its owner. The rough texture is what makes the learning possible. If a weapon made by an orcish smith fails in battle, if it breaks, if the edge gives way at a critical moment, if some flaw in the construction contributes to the warrior's death or serious injury, the smith is held responsible. The accountability is formal and it has a specific shape. The smith does not pay in gold. Gold is not the currency the tradition uses for this kind of debt. The smith makes the next weapon for the affected warrior's family free of charge. If the warrior died, the next weapon, commissioned by their family, a child coming of age, a spouse who needs a replacement blade, is made without any exchange. The smith provides it. This is the payment. It is not treated as punishment exactly. It is treated as correction. The smith made something that did not do what it was supposed to do. Someone was harmed by that failure. The way to address the harm is to provide something that works correctly without asking for anything in return. The tradition does not expect smiths to be perfect. It expects them to stand behind what they make. Those are different things, and the distinction is handled carefully. Volendrung is associated with Malakath. It appears in his domain. It is connected to his followers. It is treated, within Orcish tradition, as an artifact of his power. But Volendrung was not made by orcs. It was not made for Malakath. It did not originate anywhere near the traditions being described in this chapter. Volendrung began as a Dwemer artifact called Volendung. The Dwemer made it, the Dwemer used it, and then the Dwemer disappeared, as they always do in any account that involves them for long enough. The hammer was left behind in a world that no longer contained the people who had made it. Malakath found it, or chose it, or claimed it. The specific mechanism of the transfer is not recorded in any source that speaks to it directly. What is recorded is that the hammer changed after the claim. It became something with a different character than a Dwemer tool typically carries. The Dwemer made things for function and efficiency. What Volendrung became under Malakath's claim carries something heavier than efficiency. It carries the weight of belonging to a tradition of outcasts, of strength earned through rejection and difficulty, of the refusal to be discarded even when everything around you has decided that you should be. A Dwemer hammer, adopted by the Daedric prince of the abandoned, is either a coincidence or a statement. Given who Malakath is and how deliberately he tends to act, coincidence seems like the less satisfying explanation. Young orcs in strongholds are not permitted to carry forged weapons until they have participated in making one, not watched participated. The requirement is for actual involvement in the forging process, working the bellows, moving material, holding tools, being present at the forge in a functional capacity through at least one weapon's complete production. The belief behind this requirement is straightforward, and it has been consistent across every stronghold tradition that has been documented. You cannot truly carry something you do not understand. A weapon is not simply a tool you pick up and use. It is an object with a history that begins before you touch it, a history of decisions made at a forge, of heat and pressure, and the specific knowledge of a specific smith applied to specific material. A warrior who has never been part of that process carries the finished object without understanding what they are carrying. The Orcish tradition considers that a form of disrespect, not intentional disrespect, but the disrespect that comes from ignorance that could have been corrected. The requirement to participate in a forging before carrying a blade is the correction. It ensures that every orc who picks up a weapon knows, in their body, and not just in their understanding, what went into making it. That knowledge changes how the weapon is carried. It changes how carefully it is maintained. It changes whether the warrior bothers to go back for it when it is lost. The tradition is aware of all of this. The requirement exists because of all of this. The forge in a stronghold is not simply a place where weapons are made. It is the place where the stronghold's relationship with Malakath is maintained in the most active and continuous way. The song, the dedication, the accountability for failure, the rough grip, the recovered blade, the honest accounting of debts in hammered spikes, all of it circles back to the same understanding. A weapon made in a stronghold is not a private transaction between a smith and a warrior. It is a statement made in the presence of something that is watching and that has standards. The Orcish tradition asks more of its smiths and its warriors than most weapon cultures ask of theirs. It asks them to be honest about what they owe, to stand behind what they make, to go back for what they left behind, to learn before they carry, to give something to Malakath before they give anything to themselves. What comes out of that forge, after all of that, is not just a weapon. It is a record of whether a person met the standard that was set for them. In a tradition where the standard has never been lowered to make meeting it easier, that record means something. The weapon did not stop being important when the warrior died. In most cultures across Skyrim's history, death did not end the relationship between a fighter and their blade. It changed it. The weapon that had been carried through life became something different in death, a marker, a protection, a message, a provision for wherever the warrior was going next. The traditions around burial weapons in Skyrim are not uniform. The Nords handled it one way. The Reachmen handled it another. The Orcs had their own understanding entirely. But across all of them, the same basic belief persists in different forms. What a person carried in life was still relevant after life ended. The blade went with them, or it burned with them, or it stayed behind as a statement to anyone who came after. Tonight we move through those traditions carefully, quietly, the way the subject deserves. Nordic warriors were not buried with just one weapon, they were buried with two. That detail is significant because the two weapons were treated completely differently from each other. One was left intact, cleaned, maintained, placed in the burial in the same condition it had been carried in life. This was the weapon for the afterlife. The warrior would arrive in Sovngarde equipped. They would not go unarmed into whatever came next. The second weapon was broken before it went into the ground, deliberately broken by the people conducting the burial as part of the ceremony, rather than as an afterthought. The broken weapon served a different purpose entirely. It was a message directed not at the dead, but at the living, specifically at anyone who might consider entering the tomb uninvited. A broken blade in a burial is a statement. It says that something has already been given up here, that the people who placed it understood the weight of what they were doing, and that they were willing to destroy something valuable to make the point. Whether it functioned as an effective deterrent against grave robbers is a separate question. As a statement of intention, it was unambiguous. Draga carry weapons because those weapons were placed in their hands at burial. This is worth stating plainly because it is sometimes misunderstood. The weapons the Draga carry are not issued to them when they rise. They are not provided by whatever force animates them in the tombs. They are the same weapons that were placed with the body during the original interment, sometimes hundreds or thousands of years before the Drowa encountered anyone coming into the tomb. The burial party positioned those weapons carefully. The hands were arranged around the grip. The blade was oriented in the fighting position, rather than laid flat across the chest, the way a purely ceremonial placement would look. The intention was specific. If the warrior rose, if the burial enchantments held, and the body was called back to defend the tomb, they would rise, already armed and already holding the weapon correctly. The Draugr that stands in the dark at the end of a burial corridor, weapon in hand, is standing exactly as they were placed. Someone arranged that centuries ago, and it is still holding. There are burial sites in the rift that contain weapons that were never used, not worn, not bloodied, not carried into any battle or drawn in any conflict. The blades in these graves are in the same condition they were in when they left the forge edges unworked by contact with anything, surfaces unscratched, grips unworn by the friction of actual use. These were placed with warriors who died before they could use them, young fighters primarily, people who had been given weapons in preparation for a life of combat that did not arrive. The blades were not placed in the burial because of what they had done. They were placed there because of what they were supposed to have done, because of the potential they represented that was cut short before it could be realized. A virgin blade in a burial is a specific kind of grief. It is not the grief of loss after a full life. It is the grief of something that never had the chance to become what it was made to be. The people who placed those weapons understood the difference. They marked it with the most honest object available to them. The Reachmen did not bury their warriors' weapons, they burned them. This is one of the clearest points of difference between ancient Reach burial tradition and the Nordic practice that eventually surrounded and largely displaced it. When a Reachman warrior died, the weapon was placed on the funeral pyre with the body and burned along with it. The smoke that rose from that fire was understood to carry something, not just combustion products, not just heat and ash, but the memory of the weapon, everything the blade had been through, every fight it had witnessed, every moment it had been present for in the warrior's life. The belief was that the spirit world received what the fire sent up. The warrior arrived not just with their own spirit, but with the accumulated history of the blade they had carried. The weapon's memory traveled with them as a companion, as a record, as something that belonged to the warrior in a way that could not be separated by death any more than it had been separated by any of the difficult moments of life. The Nords preserved their weapons in burial. The Reachmen destroyed theirs deliberately. Both traditions were doing the same thing, ensuring the warrior was not separated from what mattered to them. They simply disagreed about what form that provision should take. Draga weapons degrade more slowly than the physics of the situation would suggest they should. A blade sealed inside a stone tomb for 2,000 years, in conditions of variable moisture and no maintenance, should be in considerably worse condition than most Draga weapons appear to be. Researchers who have examined recovered Draga weapons note that while they are old and while they show the marks of age, they are consistently more intact than comparable weapons from similar periods found in non-enchanted burial contexts. The explanation that has gained the most traction involves the burial enchantments themselves. The magic woven into Nordic tombs was designed to preserve what was inside, to maintain the conditions that would allow the Draga to remain functional across long periods of dormancy. That preservation does not appear to be selective. It applies to the stone, to the air inside the sealed chambers, and to the objects within the space. The weapons benefit from the same enchantments that maintain the Draga. They are held in a kind of suspended state, still aging, but aging more slowly than anything outside the tomb. What walks out of a Nordic burial, holding a weapon that is 2,000 years old, is carrying something the tomb has been quietly maintaining the entire time it waited. Some tombs in Skyrim contain weapon arrangements on the floor that do not correspond to any burial practice that researchers have been able to identify through standard documentation. The blades are laid out in patterns, not randomly dropped, not placed in individual graves, arranged deliberately across the floor of specific chambers in configurations that, when mapped from above, reproduce the troop formations of specific historical battles. The battles in question are not always easy to identify. Some of the arrangements correspond to conflicts that appear in fragmented historical records, while others correspond to battles that have not been documented anywhere outside the tomb itself. The people who arranged these weapons were recording something. They were using the only materials available to them in that space to preserve a memory of a specific moment in a specific conflict. Whether this was done as tribute, as historical record, as some form of ritual reenactment, or for reasons that do not fit any of those categories, is not clear. What is clear is that the arrangements were made with care and with knowledge. Whoever laid those blades on the floor knew the battle they were reconstructing well enough to place each weapon in the position it corresponded to. That knowledge came from somewhere. Where it went after the tomb was sealed is part of what makes these arrangements difficult to fully read. Orcish tradition on the matter of dying unarmed is direct and consistent across every stronghold account that has been recorded. A warrior who dies with a weapon in their hand has died correctly, regardless of the outcome of the fight. Losing is not the problem. Dying is not the problem. Dying without a weapon is the problem. The specific failure that the tradition identifies as the worst possible end for a fighter. The reasoning behind this is not simply about appearances or cultural pride. It connects to the Orcish understanding of what a warrior is. A warrior is someone who meets what comes toward them with a weapon in their hand. That definition does not stop applying at the moment of death. If anything, it applies most critically at that moment, because that is the moment that cannot be revised afterward. A warrior who dies armed has been a warrior until the end. A warrior who dies unarmed has, at the last possible moment, been something else. The tradition takes that distinction with complete seriousness. Orcish warriors who know they are dying make significant efforts to ensure a weapon is in their hand when it happens. Accounts exist of mortally wounded Orcish fighters refusing to release their grip on a blade, even when releasing it would have made it easier to receive help. The weapon stayed. The definition held. Not every weapon found in a tomb has always been in that tomb. Researchers examining burial sites across Skyrim have identified cases where the weapons present do not match the period of the original interment. A sword with construction characteristics of the Third Era, appearing in a burial that was clearly established in the First Era, is not an anomaly that can be explained by the original burial party having access to future technology. It means the tomb was opened after the original interment and something was added. The reasons vary by case. Some tombs appear to have been reopened to add subsequent burials, family members or followers interred alongside the original occupant across centuries of continued use. Some appear to have been temporarily used as storage by people who later left items behind, deliberately or not. Some appear to have been partially looted and then partially restocked in ways that suggest a more complicated history of entry and exit than a simple single-period burial would produce. Each out-of-period weapon is a record of a door being opened. The tomb was not always sealed. Someone came back, someone went in, and something they brought with them, or something they left behind, remained inside when the door closed again. The weapons in the tombs are still there. Most of them have not been touched in a very long time. They sit in the dark alongside the people they were placed with, intact blades and broken ones, virgin edges and worn ones, arrangements on stone floors that map battles no one living remembers fighting. The tradition that placed them was careful and specific and meant something to the people who practiced it. What it meant exactly, in every case, in every tomb, in every arrangement that is harder to recover than the weapons themselves. The weapons last. The meaning requires more effort to keep. Most weapons in Skyrim follow rules. They are made from identifiable materials. They hold enchantments that can be studied and understood. They behave in ways that fit within the frameworks that researchers, enchanters, and smiths have built up over centuries of careful observation. Most weapons make sense. The ones in this chapter do not. They contradict what should be possible. They carry properties that no known process should produce. They exist in places they should not be, do things they should not do, and resist every attempt to fit them into the categories that account for everything else. Tonight we move through the weapons that fall outside the map, the ones that sit at the edges of what Skyrim's lore can explain, and look back at the people trying to explain them without offering much help. The notched pickaxe sits at the very top of the throat of the world, not near the top. At the top, the highest accessible point in all of Skyrim, above the snowline, above the place where most living things stop being able to function. A pickaxe is a mining tool. It is not classified as a weapon by any imperial or hold administrative standard. It does not appear in any weapons catalogue or enchanted arms registry. It is, by every official measure, a tool. What it carries inside it is not what tools typically carry. The enchantment on the notched pickaxe improves the smithing ability of whoever holds it, not marginally, not in a way that a minor enchantment might produce, but at a level that rivals the enhancement provided by dedicated combat and craft enchantments on purpose-built weapons. The quality of that enchantment in a tool found at the summit of the highest mountain in the province, with no accompanying documentation and no record of who placed it there or why, does not fit any mundane explanation. Someone put it there. The enchantment on it suggests that someone understood exactly what they were doing. Everything else about its presence at that location remains unaccounted for. The pickaxe sits at the top of the world, classified as a tool, carrying the enchantment of something considerably more intentional, and offering no explanation for any of it. The Wabberjack is described as unpredictable. That description is accurate, but incomplete in a way that matters. Unpredictable implies, random implies that the outcomes it produces have no relationship to each other and follow no pattern that could be identified with enough observation. Researchers who have studied the Wabberjack's effects in detail do not believe it is random. The outputs it produces are too varied, too specific, and too consistently surprising to be the result of pure chance. Pure chance, applied often enough, begins to show statistical patterns. The Wabberjack does not show those patterns. What it shows instead is something that looks more like a logic that operates on entirely different principles than the ones researchers are using to analyze it. Sheogorath built something into the staff that responds to situations, to people, to the specific texture of a given moment, in ways that produce outcomes perfectly calibrated to be maximally disruptive to whatever expectation was present. The surprise is not accidental. The surprise is the point. The staff does not malfunction. It succeeds at something that researchers have simply not been able to define clearly enough to study. Every attempt to decode the Wabbajack's logic has ended in the same place, a recognition that the logic exists, combined with a complete inability to say what it is. In Labyrinthian, among the ruins of what was once a significant center of magical study and practice, there is a bow that has no string, not a bow whose string has rotted away over time, leaving the bow itself intact but non-functional. A bow that functions without a string, that draws and releases and sends arrows, without any physical mechanism connecting the two limbs. The bow appears to be using residual, magical tension in place of the physical string. The ruins of Labyrinthian are saturated with ambient magical energy from centuries of intensive practice within those walls. The leading explanation is that the bow, left there long enough, absorbed enough of that ambient energy to develop a functional substitute for its missing component. The tension that a string would provide mechanically is being provided instead by something the bow accumulated from its environment over a very long period of time. Whether this process could be replicated intentionally, whether a bow could be deliberately exposed to ambient magical energy long enough to develop the same property, has not been tested. The bow in Labyrinthian remains the only documented example of the phenomenon. It sits in a ruin, drawing and releasing without a string, doing something that the people who made it did not design it to do, because it has been there long enough to become something they did not intend. Weapons exist in Apocrypha that cannot leave it. Hermaeus Mora's realm is full of objects, texts, artifacts, tools, arms that have accumulated there across the long period of his collecting. Some of those weapons are genuinely remarkable, unusual materials, enchantments that do not correspond to anything produced in Tamriel, construction methods that suggest origins outside the known world. Visitors to Apocrypha who have attempted to carry these weapons back through the portal to Tamriel have found that the weapons do not survive the crossing. The dissolution is immediate and complete the moment the weapon crosses the threshold between Mora's realm and the physical world. It comes apart, not dramatically, not with any visible reaction. It simply stops being a solid object and becomes nothing. The explanation most commonly offered involves the weapons being anchored to Apocrypha in a way that prevents their removal, either deliberately by Mora or as a natural consequence of the weapons having spent so long in a realm with fundamentally different physical rules that they can no longer exist in a realm that operates differently. What Apocrypha holds, in many cases, it keeps. The weapons there are visible, real, and functional within the realm. Outside it, they cannot exist. The knowledge of what they were and what they could do stays on the other side of a door that closes behind anyone who tries to bring that knowledge home in physical form. The long hammer is heavier than it should be. This is not a subjective impression from the people who have carried it. It has been placed on measurement instruments. The weight is objectively higher than the composition of the metal would produce in a solid object of its dimensions. Metallurgical examination of the long hammer identified something unexpected. The hammer contains a hollow cavity, a space inside the head where there is no metal. A hollow cavity should make an object lighter than a solid object of the same external dimensions. The long hammer is heavier. The cavity is there. The extra weight is also there. Both of these things are confirmed. They should not be able to coexist in the same object, and yet they do. The explanations that have been proposed range from an unidentified dense material filling the cavity that the examination did not detect, to an enchantment that adds weight without adding mass, to a spatial anomaly inside the hammerhead that somehow contributes gravitational pull without contributing material. None of these explanations has been confirmed. The longhammer sits with both its cavity and its impossible weight intact, and the question of how it manages to be simultaneously hollow and heavier than solid has not been resolved by anyone who has examined it. Some Falmer weapons carry Dwemer symbols, not decorations that happen to resemble Dwemer markings. Actual Dwemer production stamps the same kind of identifying marks found on confirmed Dwemer manufactured items, pressed into Falmer weapon components with the same depth and format as authentic Dwemer stamps. The implications of this are significant, regardless of which explanation turns out to be correct. The first possibility is that there was a period during the Dwemer enslavement of the Falmer when the Falmer were involved in Dwemer weapon production under direct supervision, working under conditions where Dwemer stamps were applied to items they helped produce. The second possibility is that a third party, not the Dwemer and not the Falmer, was producing items that carried Dwemer stamps for reasons that have not been identified. The third possibility is that the stamps were applied to Falmer weapons after the Dwemer disappeared, by someone who had access to Dwemer stamping tools and a reason to use them. Each of these possibilities opens a different set of questions that the existing evidence does not answer. The stamps are there. The Dwemer who might explain them are not. The gap between those two facts has not been bridged by anything recovered from any Dwemer ruin or Falmer site examined so far. The ebony blade never needs to be recharged. Every other weapon that carries an enchantment in Skyrim eventually expends whatever is powering it and requires a soul gem to restore the effect. The ebony blade does not reach that point. The enchantment on it remains active and functional, regardless of how much it is used, and regardless of how long it sits unused between uses. No soul gem has ever been required. No diminishment in the enchantment's effectiveness has been documented across any period of continuous use. Where the ebony blade draws its energy from is genuinely unknown. The enchantment that feeds on betrayal, that grows stronger through acts of treachery against those who trusted the wielder, provides a mechanism for the blade to accumulate power. But that accumulation does not account for the baseline function that persists even when the blade has not been used for betrayal in a significant period. Something is powering it continuously. That something has not been identified. Mephala, who governs the blade, has not offered clarification. The blade continues to function, drawing on whatever it draws on, and the enchanters who have examined it continue to note the absence of any depletion without being able to explain what prevents it. The weapons discovered in Raldbithar carry two sets of information that cannot both be correct simultaneously. Dating methods applied to the metal itself, examining the crystalline structure of the Dwemer alloy and comparing it to samples from confirmed periods, place the weapons in an extremely early production period. The metal is old, genuinely, verifiably old, in ways that the testing methods used are reliable enough to confirm. The enchantment style on those same weapons is characteristic of the late Third Era, a period thousands of years after the metal should have been produced. Enchantment styles change across eras, the way architectural styles change. Researchers who specialize in enchantment history can identify the period a spell was cast by examining the binding method, the soul gem signature left in the casting, and the structural logic of how the enchantment was anchored to the object. The enchantments on the Raldbithar weapons test as late Third Era consistently. The metal tests as ancient consistently. These two facts cannot coexist in an object with a straightforward history. The weapons are either ancient metal with recently added enchantments, which raises questions about who added them and why, or they are something else entirely that the available testing methods are not equipped to handle correctly. Neither explanation has been confirmed. The weapons carry their contradictory timestamps and offer nothing that resolves them. Mirak's staff produces tentacles. This is stated plainly, because the plain statement is already strange enough that elaboration is almost secondary. The tentacles move. They move independently of the staff and independently of any direction from the person holding it. They respond to the environment around them in ways that suggest something closer to autonomous behavior than to the movement of a conjured effect. Conjured effects in Skyrim follow understood patterns. A bound weapon is a magical construct that occupies a fixed shape and behaves predictably within the parameters of the conjuration. A summoned creature is an entity with its own will, brought temporarily into the physical world. The tentacles, produced by Mirak's staff, fit neither category cleanly. They are not fixed constructs, they move too independently for that. They are not summoned entities, they do not have the behavioral profile of creatures with separate wills. No enchantment framework currently used in magical scholarship has produced a satisfying account of how autonomous movement in a conjured limb is possible. What is producing the will that directs that movement, and where that directing intelligence resides when the staff is not in use? Mirak's connection to Hermaeus Mora and the time he spent in Apocrypha developing abilities that do not correspond to anything produced through normal Tamrielic magical study is the most commonly cited context for the staff's existence. That context explains where it came from in a general sense. It does not explain how it works. The tentacles move. The question of what is moving them remains open. The weapons in this chapter do not fit. They resist the categories that account for everything else. They carry properties that should not be possible, origins that cannot be confirmed, behaviors that no existing framework adequately explains. They are not malfunctions. They are not errors. They are the places where Skyrim's lore reaches the edge of what it can account for and finds something looking back. The map ends somewhere. These weapons are what sits just past the edge of it. Every weapon in Skyrim started as material, ore pulled from the ground, bone taken from something that was once alive, wood shaped from a tree that stood in cold air for decades before it was cut. At some point, hands touched that material and made it into something with a purpose. That transformation from raw material to object with intention is where the story of every weapon begins. But it is not where the story ends. Tonight is the last chapter. We are not moving through facts in the way the earlier chapters moved through them. We are sitting with something quieter, what these weapons hold, what they carry, what they remember, in the only way that objects can remember, by being changed, slowly and permanently, by everything that happens to them. A blade that has been through 100 battles is not the same object as a blade that has never been used. The difference is not always visible. The edge might be maintained. The metal might show no significant damage. The grip might be intact. But something has changed in the object that cannot be accounted for purely by examining its physical condition. This is not a mystical claim in the way Skyrim lore sometimes makes mystical claims. It is something closer to a practical observation that a large number of people across many eras and many cultures in Tamriel have made independently. A used weapon feels different from an unused one, not in weight, not in balance, assuming both have been maintained correctly. In something else, something that the people who work with weapons most closely tend to describe in terms of presence or weight or character rather than in technical terms. The weapon has been through something. That passage leaves a mark that is not always physical, but is consistently real to the people who encounter it. In Skyrim's lore, weapons are treated as records of this kind, not passive storage, not something that simply accumulates experience the way a surface accumulates dust, something that is genuinely changed by what it passes through. The companions have a specific belief about this. It is not a formal doctrine, not something written into their code or stated in their oaths. It is more like a shared understanding that develops among people who spend their lives working with weapons and paying close attention to what that experience produces. The belief is that a weapon inherits something from every fight it survives. The inheritance is not physical. It cannot be measured or weighed or identified through examination, but it can be felt specifically by the body of a person who picks up a weapon that has been through significant use. The companions describe this as a recognition. The hand knows, before the mind has had time to assess anything, that this is an object with history, that it has been somewhere and done something and come back changed in ways that now inform how it feels to hold it. New blades do not produce this recognition. Old ones do. The companions do not treat this as superstition. They treat it as information, the kind of information that comes from paying careful attention to what the body notices before the mind starts interpreting. Some weapons in Skyrim have no origin that can be traced. They appear in the historical record fully formed, already old, already carrying the marks of use, with no documentation of who made them, where they were made, or how they came to be in the location where they were found. This is not unusual for weapons that have simply been lost and found again. That pattern is common and well documented. What distinguishes these particular weapons is that the absence of origin documentation is complete, not fragmentary, not partially reconstructed from related sources. Complete. There is no thread to follow backward. The weapons exist. Their history, prior to the moment they were first documented, does not exist in any recoverable form. Several of these weapons show stylistic characteristics that do not correspond to any known smithing tradition. The materials are identifiable, but the construction method does not match any school or regional technique that researchers have catalogued. Someone made them. That someone left no trace that connects back to any identifiable group of people working in any identifiable time and place. The weapons appeared. Where they came from before they appeared is a question the record cannot answer. Enchanters who study old weapons describe the enchantments on them differently than they describe enchantments on newer objects. The term that appears most consistently across independent accounts from different researchers working in different periods is settled. An old enchantment feels settled. The spell does not feel like something applied to the object from outside and held in place by the structure of the binding. It feels like something that has been in the object long enough to stop being a separate thing and start being part of the object itself. The binding has relaxed. The spell has adjusted to the specific character of the material it inhabits. The relationship between the enchantment and the object has had time to become something more integrated than new enchantments display. Enchanters, who work primarily with new materials, sometimes find old enchantments difficult to study because the usual markers that distinguish enchantment from base material are less distinct. The settled quality that makes old enchantments feel different is the same quality that makes them harder to analyze cleanly. Time changes the relationship between a spell and the object carrying it. Given enough time, the two become harder to separate. A weapon found abandoned in the wilderness is never without information. The condition of the blade says something about how long it has been there and what conditions it has been exposed to. The type of ground it rests on, whether it is half buried in soft earth, lying on exposed rock, or caught in the roots of a tree, suggests something about how it arrived. The direction it points, if it has not been disturbed, sometimes corresponds to something in the landscape that the original owner was moving toward or away from. Hunters and trackers across Skyrim have developed a practice of reading abandoned weapons the way they read other signs in the wilderness, not as definitive information, but as one part of a larger picture that, assembled carefully, tells a partial story. The weapon is the last physical evidence of someone's presence in a specific place at a specific time. What happened to them after that moment is not in the weapon, but what the weapon can tell to someone who knows how to ask the right questions of it is more than most people think to look for. Not every weapon that is kept for years is kept for practical reasons. Some weapons in Skyrim carry nothing that would justify keeping them on a purely functional basis. No enchantment, no unusual material, no exceptional quality of construction, no name, no history, no association with any person or event that would make them significant to anyone outside the person carrying them. And yet they are carried, for years, sometimes for a lifetime. The people who carry them often struggle to explain why, in terms that satisfy someone asking from outside the relationship. The law tradition that addresses this uses a specific word for it: chosen. The weapon was chosen, not selected through a process of evaluation, not picked because it outperformed alternatives, but recognized. The person carrying it encountered it at a specific moment, and something in that encounter established a connection that subsequent evaluation could not dissolve. The weapon did not earn the relationship through its properties. The relationship existed before the properties were assessed. The law tradition treats this as a real phenomenon, not as sentiment or irrationality, but as a form of recognition between a person and an object that occasionally happens in ways that precede conscious understanding. The weapon was chosen. That is the complete explanation, and within the tradition, it is considered sufficient. The oldest weapon believed to be in active use in Skyrim during the Fourth Era is estimated to be over 2,000 years old. The estimate comes from examining the construction style, the metal composition, and what can be determined about the enchantment applied to it. 2,000 years is a span of time that is difficult to hold in the mind as a concrete reality. It means the weapon was made before the Septim Empire, before the events of the Oblivion Crisis, before most of the political and cultural structures that define Skyrim's current world had taken the forms they now hold. The person who made it is unknown. The people who carried it across those 2,000 years are mostly unknown. What is known is the weapon itself still functional, still balanced in the way that good weapons remain balanced when they are maintained properly, still sharp enough to do what it was made to do. 2,000 years of use and maintenance and passing from hand to hand, and the fundamental object is still what it was when it was made. The only thing that is not what it was when it was made is everything that has been added to it since every fight, every owner, every maintenance session, every moment it was cleaned and set down and picked up again. The object is the same. What it carries is vastly different from what it started with. Skyrim's weapon lore arrives, at the end, at something quiet, not a conclusion exactly, more like a recognition. These objects are not inert, they are not passive. They do not simply sit in the world, unchanged and unchanging, waiting to be picked up and put down again without consequence. They are changed by what they pass through. They hold the weight of the hands that carried them. In a world where the law consistently tells us that souls persist, that what a person is does not simply end when the body stops. The weight that accumulates in these objects is not metaphorical. It is something that the world Skyrim describes would treat as genuinely real. Every blade in every tomb, every named weapon with its history, every abandoned sword lying in the grass, pointing towards something its owner never reached. Every weapon that was chosen rather than selected, inherited rather than bought, carried for a lifetime without being able to explain why. They all hold something. The weight is real. The question of what to do with that knowledge is one that Skyrim leaves quietly in your hands, the way it leaves most of its deepest questions without an answer, but with enough information to sit with it thoughtfully for a very long time. The fires in the hearths of Skyrim burn low at this hour. The wind moves across the mountains the way it always has. Somewhere in the dark, in a tomb or a ruin or a quiet field under open sky, a blade is resting, still, patient, holding everything it has ever been through. It does not need you to remember it. It remembers itself, in the only way objects can, by being exactly, permanently, and completely what everything that has ever happened to it has made it. That is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep now. The weapons are where they are. They will still be there in the morning.